The orphanage was preparing for the graduation of its children. The carers and teachers were sincerely trying to make this day as solemn and memorable for the orphans as it was for all the children in all the schools, so no one had to leave without a farewell and a kind word. The adults loved them, wished them happiness, and hoped that everything would turn out well for them. "For you girls, I am calm," said the favorite teacher of Lucy and Julia, who stood in the assembly hall, hugging each other. "You have dreams, aspirations, and all chances to achieve what you want. Most importantly, don't lose your friendship. Stay together always." "I will," the girls promised. "We're sisters." And of course, they weren't sisters. They had just been friends since childhood. This friendship even surprised some people how different Lucy and Julia were. They were similar only in their fates. Both knew nothing about their parents. But there were many of them in the orphanage, and the girls were not upset about it. They were just like everyone else. Lucy, however, as a teenager once talked about wanting to find her mom. But Julia didn't support that idea. "I'm not going to look for anyone. I don't see why it's necessary. If they don't want us, we don't want them either. Why impose? Besides, there are such stories that children find their parents and then regret it themselves. A few years ago, we were told that there was a girl like that. After graduation, she searched and searched, found both mom and dad, and now she doesn't know how to get rid of them. They come to her all the time and ask for money. What do we need parents like that for?" "Of course we don't. I just thought I might have others," Lucy confessed. "Famous artists, for example. They're the same, or even worse. They'll start telling you fairy tales that you were stolen, switched, and all that. In fact, they refused, that's all. So don't fill your head with nonsense. Of course, if some millionaire doesn't find me and tell me he's my daddy, I won't refuse. But that's probably never going to happen. I won't look for it myself. No millionaires, no drunks," Julia laughed. "And I'm not going to look for them either. Where would I look for them? We needed them when we were kids. Now we're almost grown-ups," Lucy agreed, smiling too, but there was sadness in her voice. That's how they were. The bright brunette Julia, cheerful, active, and independent. And Lucy, pale with fullness, quiet and thoughtful, always ready to agree with her friend. She was not at all depressed by this position. Nor did Julia take much advantage of it. They simply loved each other and quite seriously considered that they were not friends, but even more than sisters. But their dreams were different. Julia as a child saw a film in which the main character was a stewardess and was struck by the beauty of the girl and the romanticism of this profession. She immediately declared that she too would be a stewardess when she grew up. Someone laughed at her. Someone said that it was too dangerous profession. Some did not believe that Julia would achieve what she wanted. But for her, none of this mattered. She knew that she would definitely be only a stewardess. She was also sure that her friend would go with her to study and then to work, and they would be together again, both on the ground and in the sky. But here she was disappointed. For the first time in her life, Lucy disagreed with her. "Oh, come on, Julia, what stewardesses? It's more suited to you. You're brave and beautiful. I'm a coward, you know. I'm afraid of flying," she said. "Like you've flown a lot. You've never even seen an aeroplane. And once you get above the clouds, you can't get out of it," Julia urged her. "Well, it might be fun to fly once. But if this is going to be your job, you know what I am, Julia. I want to get married, have kids, to take care of them, to love them. What kind of family would that be if I'm always flying around? No, that's not the right job for me. I've decided to go to teacher training college. I'll be a kindergarten teacher. That's for sure. For me, I'll learn to bring up my children properly, and it'll be easier with my own. And this job is quite suitable for a family man. I think it's a boring job. It's the same thing all day long. What good is it to have kids at home and at work? I might get married someday too, but that's later. Besides, I'll try to marry a pilot. We'll fly together." Julia disagreed with her. "And do you take your children on a flight or leave them with strangers?" Lucy wondered. "When I have children, I won't leave them to anyone. I'll nurse and raise them myself, and I'll be near them every minute." "Oh, you're dreaming. Family, children. I want to see the world, and being a stewardess is just the right profession for that." "Well, yes, of course it does. But you can see the world without leaving home for a long time. You can go on holiday, say, and fly somewhere. and then return to your favorite home and live there quietly with wonderful impressions. Oh ho ho ho. You're going to be a homebody. I didn't expect that from you. Although, of course, everyone has their own destiny. I won't argue with you. It might even work out better this way. You'll go on holiday on my plane, and I'll leave my children to you on the flights. It suited both of them. At first, however, they still hoped that they would be able to stay together after they left the orphanage. Lucy thought that Julia would leave her dream and choose a more earthly profession. She, on the contrary, did not give up hope of taking her friend with her. They lived in a small town where there was a teacher training college. But here is no educational institution where they teach stewardesses. Alas, there was no. Julia had to follow her dream to the big city. She hoped that she could get into New York, but no. The school she tried to get into didn't accept her. She had to go to Chicago. As they parted, both girls cried and vowed not to forget each other. Oh, Julia, I can't imagine. I can't imagine you going away and me being alone. What will I do without you? Lucy hugged her friend. I told you, come with me together. We'll study, Julia consoled her. And it's not too late now. I bet there's all sorts of schools there. No, I've already enrolled here and I'll stay here. Why go anywhere else? But we'll never leave each other. We'll write to each other, we'll call each other back, right? You'll miss me too. As if you're the one who's going to get married, just like you dreamed. You won't have time for me. Oh, life is short. I didn't realize it would be so hard to part with you. We really are like family, aren't we? You're my only family. And when someone else comes along, a husband, kids, I won't forget you, I promise. You're the closest thing I have to a sister. And I'll teach you to love my own. For the first time after Chicago, that's how it was. Friends wrote each other long letters, talked on the phone for hours, sharing news. But adult life turned out to be much more complicated and intense than they thought. Communication became increasingly rare. They had to study, learn new professions. In addition, each of them had her own circle of acquaintances. Of course, no one could replace each other. That was out of the question. But these new friends were close by. And the girls, because of the distance, could not meet whenever they wanted. Even on holidays, there were always some things to do that prevented them from visiting each other, but they tried to stay in touch. It wasn't difficult. After all, they were used to telling their named sister everything first. So Julia learned that Lucy's biggest dream might soon come true. She had met the man she was going to marry. Congratulations, my dear, Julia shouted over the phone. Now your dream has come true. Mine, by the way, will soon come true too. I'm graduating from school and soon I'll be a real stewardess. But tell me, who's your fiancé? What's his name and a picture? I need to know who I'm trusting my own sister with. Oh, Julia, I don't have any pictures. He doesn't like to be photographed. He says he's not good at it, and I think that's true. He's really not very photogenic. Even in his passport photo, he looks much older than his age. He's cute, though. Name's Norman, and he seems to love me, too. I hope you'll invite me to the wedding, and I'll be able to get away. Because, you know, I won't have much time now. We stewardesses don't belong to ourselves. No, I'm never getting married without you. I really need to, so please carve out a day for me sometime. Tell me what time you'll be free so I know, too. I've missed you so much. After graduation, they did get to see each other. Julia came to her hometown, but not for long, just to see her friend. She didn't plan to stay. She had a job waiting for her. It turned out that Lucy's wedding was still only in the plans, although Norman had already proposed to her. Julia couldn't see her best friend's fiancé either. Just at that time, he had gone somewhere on business, although Lucy could not even explain where he worked. She said something about her lover going to set up his own business. She also showed a photo of her Norman, but it was very poor quality indeed. Either her fiancé was unattractive or the photography was poor. They couldn't really see his face. Julia, just so as not to offend her friend, said that her fiancé was very handsome, though she herself found such mystery strange. It is not clear. He does not want to be photographed. Where he works, as I realized, he did not say exactly anything, just some kind of secret agent. I don't even know whether to trust such people. But on the other hand, what can I do? I can't stop her from seeing the man she really loves, Julia thought, and you can tell. However, in a short meeting, The friends could not tear themselves away from each other, and therefore the absence of strangers, even if it was their favorite fiancé, was even to their advantage. They had a great time together and made sure that their friendship and even kinship had not gone anywhere. Soon, however, they had to part. Again they cried, hugged, and swore to each other in eternal love and friendship. "Say hello to your Norman and tell him that your sister will never let you down," Julia joked through her tears. "Oh no, he would never hurt me," Lucy sobbed. "I tell him all about you. I give him my regards. Have you found yourself a pilot yet?" "No, really. I'm taking it slow. You know, I want to go international after all. But you have to know languages, and I was lazy at school. I didn't get it right, so I'll fly around the country, but I'd like to go abroad." "But you'll always get what you want. To be honest, I didn't even believe you'd get into this school. But not only did you get in, you graduated. Julia, I'm so proud of you." And again they were sure that they would part for a short time, that they would meet often, that they would be in constant contact. But as usual, life makes adjustments to our plans. Julia, busy with flights, could not always find a minute for dialogue. She couldn't even make it to her friend's wedding. She just couldn't. She was busy at work. Lucy was not offended, although a little sad about it. But her lover was always there to comfort her. "Come on, Lucy. What other girlfriends are there?" "A married woman doesn't need friends. We don't need anyone but each other, do we?" He really did limit Lucy's social circle at once. They didn't even have a wedding, which all girls dream of, and there wasn't any. Lucy wanted to invite at least her friends from the orphanage, from the school, but Norman said it was completely unnecessary. "I'm sorry, darling, but there's no money for a wedding at the moment, and I don't see any point in getting a bunch of people together and making a big fuss and throwing a lot of money at it. Let's just get married, have a little evening, just the two of us. It's our party, our future family." "I'm in. Yes, I too find all these noisy gatherings tiresome," Lucy agreed, as always. "But at least one friend is necessary. Well, as a witness at least." "That's not a good idea at all." "Well, you invite one friend, then gossip will start that you only invited one, and that was just to sign the papers. That would be even worse. I've checked. You can do it without witnesses now." Lucy agreed to that too. She couldn't argue, especially with the people she loved. Of course she was upset that Julia wasn't coming. But how could she not? She had work to do. Maybe she'll come and visit sometime. Julia herself was very upset about not being at her friend's wedding. Then she phoned, congratulated her, and asked her to send her photos at least. Lucy's reply stunned her. "We didn't have a wedding. We just signed our names and that was it. No guests, no witnesses. You know, money's really tight right now. Norman's trying to start a new business. He's got every penny he can get his hands on." "Well, that's understandable. Businessman," Julie agreed this time, though she didn't like that kind of business-like behavior. "Sa, business is business, but how can you not give your favorite woman a holiday?" However, she did not want to upset Lucy with a surprise. All the more that her friend pleased her with one more piece of news. "We're going to have a baby soon. Can you imagine how happy I am?" "Oh well, I'll be off. Norman's here," and she broke off the conversation without the usual goodbyes and kisses. She's lost her head in love, Julia decided. But she had no time to speculate on the strangeness of her friend's life. She had business to attend to. Communication had almost disappeared since then, except that they hurriedly congratulated each other on holidays. It is understandable. One has a favorite job, the other has a happy family life. I mean, dreams come true. What's to regret about friendship? Although the friendship in general remained, they didn't quarrel and they weren't going to stop talking to each other. They just didn't have time. Julia found out about Lucy's baby girl when she was a month old. "I'm sorry I didn't call and tell you straight away. You know, there's no time at all. I really don't have time now. There's so much to do with children. I had no idea," Lucy excused herself. "Oh, really? I understand. Norman's probably helping, isn't he?" "Of course Norman's a good boy. He's very fond of Emily and me," she said cheerfully. "Emily? That's a very nice name. Well done." "Emily Smith then," said her friend, happy for Lucy. No wanted Julia. But Norman said it's no good naming a living person after a living person. So I called her Emily. It's a good name. "Well, my Emily's a very good name. I'll be sure to send you a picture." And that was the end of the conversation. And Julia thought, with some displeasure, that Lucy seemed to be completely under the power of her Norman. But what could she do? She had always been so soft, so pliable. It's not the worst quality for family life. She received a photograph of Lucy with her daughter in her arms a few months later. The young mum had no time to be distracted by her friends. Julia took no offense, but again she was surprised that even here there was no young father in the picture. Well, that's a bit much. And is she married? Perhaps some scoundrel has deceived her, and she now hides it, because she is ashamed. But where is it that best friends don't send a picture of their husbands? If I found a fiancé, I'd brag about it, although what to hide from me? Even if I had a baby not married, I would not judge. I'd even help in any way I could. Oh, I'd have to go and see what kind of life they have there. Maybe it's really hard. It doesn't matter if I have no husband or a husband like that, Julia thought unhappily. Her doubts were in vain, but her worries were not unfounded. Lucy had indeed married, and was indeed very fond of her Norman, but his behavior sometimes seemed strange even to her. He really didn't want to be photographed, didn't want to meet friends, didn't introduce her to his relatives or acquaintances. He didn't go anywhere himself, and he wouldn't let her go anywhere. That is, not that he forbade it, just showed his displeasure when she, for example, even at the very beginning of their life together said that they are expected to have a reunion of graduates of the orphanage. Are you going to go? He raised an eyebrow in surprise. Why shouldn't I go? I'm very interested to see what we've become. It's been 5 years since we graduated. You can come with me too, she said uncertainly. That's all I need. I wouldn't advise you to go either. What's so interesting? They'll get together and start going. Do you remember? Do you know? Who's bragging? Who's complaining? Who are you looking at? You're all basically strangers already. So you don't think I should go? Well, if you want to go, sure, Norman shrugged. But it was clear from the look on his face that he would very much disapprove of Lucy going to this meeting. Yeah, to be honest, I don't really want to. You're right, I probably shouldn't go anywhere. Let me bake a fish pie tonight, she said in a changed tone. That's the thing, said her husband cheerfully. And that was the end of the incident. Lucy realized that he didn't want her to go out and meet anyone. It seemed flattering in a way. He wants her with him all the time. He's afraid someone will take her away. Whether that was true or not doesn't matter. After that, Lucy never talked about going out or meeting anyone. The two of them would sometimes go out, go somewhere. And that was enough. She missed Julia sometimes, but she couldn't go to her. You can't go to see her when she's flying in the sky, and you can't tell on the ground what city she's in at the moment. And somehow Lucy realized that she didn't even want Julia to come. Doesn't want to because of Norman. There's no telling how he'll react to this meeting. Having just met him, Lucy had often told her about her named sister. Then she noticed that Norman was uncomfortable with these conversations. He must really love me. If he's jealous of my friend, she decided. She never mentioned Julia again and tried to talk on the telephone when Norman was not at home. It was not only because of him, however, that she had cut down her communication with her friend. Lucy really had no time. She was completely immersed in her family life and motherhood, and would be perfectly happy if it were not for her health, which increasingly began to let her down. As a child, Lucy was told that her heart was weak and was exempted from physical education. But that was in junior high school. When she grew up, it seems that her heart got stronger, and she ran and jumped, as well as other children. That is, maybe not so fast and high, but she never refused to play mobile games, and when she grew up, she forgot that she had any problems at all. But only when she was examined already pregnant. The doctors said that motherhood could be too serious for Lucy, but could it scare the girl who dreamed of being a mother all her life, and not one, but several children? She was sure that the doctors are over-insured, everything is fine with her. And childbirth, they say, is a miracle. And after them, many women have no health problems at all. She'll probably have the same. In any case, she will definitely get stronger from happiness and will be a great mom to her baby. Emily's birth had not been easy, but Lucy was more concerned about the child's condition than her own. There was nothing wrong with her daughter, and that was enough to make her happy. She said nothing to her husband about the trouble. Yes, he, in fact, was not interested. So yes, when the euphoria of the first crush passed, Lucy began to notice a certain detachment on his part. He seemed to live with her, loved her, and his daughter was happy. At least he said so. But it was impossible to say that he helped her with the child or cared for them in any way. But what loving woman would not think of 1,000 excuses for the dearest man? I mean, he's got a business to run. He's organizing his own business, thus looking after our welfare. When Norman has his own business, then we'll be happy. In the meantime, what can we do? We can be patient. We are not living so badly, thought Lucy. Besides, Norman's business was always in trouble. He was taking out loans, getting into debt, getting annoyed. Lucy's advice was gentile. Maybe you shouldn't get involved in all this. Why don't you get a regular job? And I'll get out of maternity leave. I'll get a job too. Listen, if you do not think anything, would shut up, irritatedly cut off such speech's husband. What kind of work? Locksmith or what at the factory? Thank you on these pennies, plus your salary, only to starve to death. And by the way, your needs are not small, one thing and another. What did you say the other day? Do you need some medicine that costs so much? You need to take pots out of the kindergarten for 6 months for them. Come on, Norman. It's not like I'm asking you for these drugs. The doctor prescribed them. When I found out how much they cost, I refused to buy them. I'm not sick enough to spend that kind of money. They really had no money for treatment. That's why she stopped going to the doctor, although she didn't feel the best. But what good are these doctors? They would offer to go to the hospital, go to a sanatorium, again prescribe these pills. She couldn't afford anything like that. So she hoped that somehow it would go away. After all, heart patients sometimes live to a ripe old age. Perhaps Lucy would have, if the worst had not happened. Her husband died. The story was clearly connected with business, with the intrigues of competitors. Lucy was sure of that. Why else would his car suddenly burst into flames and plummeted off the bridge into the river at full speed? The car had been recovered, but there wasn't even the body of the dead Norman. Only some fragments, burnt beyond recognition, were buried in a closed coffin. It undermined Lucy completely. But then again, she had no time to take care of herself. No sooner had she buried her husband than another blow struck. It turned out that Norman owed several banks, and now his debt was transferred to the heiress, that is Lucy. And it was truly frightening. Creditors demanded repayment of the debt, and she had nothing, only a sick heart and a 4-year-old daughter in her arms. That's when she realized the horror of the situation she had unwittingly found herself in. She was all alone. Norman had shielded her from all socializing, apparently hoping that he would always be there for her. Now that he was gone, she had no one to turn to for help, and she needed help. Eventually, she felt so bad that she had to call an ambulance. "You need to go to the hospital immediately," the doctor said. "I can't. I have a daughter," Lucy replied fearfully. "Call relatives, acquaintances. Do you want to leave your daughter an orphan? Do you have anyone?" "No, I mean a friend, but she's a stewardess. I don't know where she is now." "You'll find out. It's not that hard. It doesn't matter where she works. If it's about your life and your daughter's life, you can leave any job. And if that's not possible, tell us. We'll try to get the girl into an orphanage." That was what Lucy feared the most. No, her memories of life in an orphanage were not so bad, but to imagine her Emily in the state walls, it was impossible. "I'll be sure to find Julia. She will help us. Only after that I can go to the hospital, but I can't leave my daughter now. And I don't want to give her to an orphanage," she said firmly. Of course, she still has her friend's phone number, but she was not sure that she would answer right away. And what would she say? Lucy had said they were sisters, but in fact they were strangers, and they drifted apart too much lately. When everything was fine, I didn't need her. Now all of a sudden I'm asking for help with how this is going to look, thought Lucy, who didn't feel comfortable calling. After all, she didn't even know how Julia was living now. Maybe she herself had been married a long time ago, had a child. It could be anything. But in any case, she had no one else to turn to. So she dialed a number she'd almost forgotten. Luckily, Julie answered. "Julia," Lucy only whispered and wept bitterly, unable to say another word. "What's the matter?" exclaimed her friend. Lucy, overcoming her sobs, gave a brief account of all that had happened lately in her life. "I realize you've got your own things going on and—" "What are you talking about?" replied her friend fearfully and anxiously. "What business can there be if you have a situation like this? I'll be there soon. I'll do what I can. But right now I'm unfortunately far away. So please wait a couple of days. Besides, I have to write a statement at work. But don't worry, Don't get upset. I'm sure everything will be all right." Poor Lucy, she wasn't sure at all. She felt that she had not long to live, and all hope now lay in the only person she had left, Julia. And Julia came as promised. And a couple of days later, but only to send her named sister to the hospital. Lucy was in a very bad way by then. The ambulance doctor who arrived only threw up his hands. "But can you really take so long? I don't know if we'll get her home alive." "You will. Do what you want, but she has to live," Julia pleaded. "And Emily? What about Emily?" Lucy asked in a weak voice. "She'll be all right. I'm with her, don't worry. We'll come and see you at the hospital. In the meantime, stay calm and please, you can't worry." Lucy closed her eyes, apparently a little relieved, at least for her daughter's fate. She had no more energy left to rejoice at her friend's arrival. Julia came to see her the next day. At first she approached the doctor, asking about possible prospects, but he only frowned. "What is there to say? We can only hope for the best, but just in case, prepare for the worst." Walking into the room, Julia realized that her friend probably wouldn't have to wait long for that worst. That's how bad Lucy looked. She wanted to cheer her up, but Lucy gestured for her to stop, asking her to lean lower. Speaking louder, she didn't have the energy. "Julia, you forgive me for God's sake for not writing or calling for a long time. But you see now, you're the only one we have, both Emily and me. Just you, no one else." Julia started to speak, but Lucy stopped her again. "Wait, don't interrupt. There isn't much time at all now. I understand everything, don't I? I don't have long to live. And all I'm worried about is Emily. Who will she stay with? Will she have to grow up in an orphanage like you and me? Julia, promise me you won't leave her, at least visit her, so she knows she has a soulmate in the world." Julia wanted, as usual, to ask her friend not to talk nonsense, to assure her that she would live happily ever after, that she would raise her daughter and see her grandchildren. But looking into Lucy's fading eyes, she, holding back her sobs, said, "Don't worry, little sister. No matter what happens, I won't leave Emily. She will not go to any orphanage. She will live with me. Just as you and I always dreamed of being together when we were kids. I'll be with her now. And with you too. Lucy, my darling, get well. I can't be without you. Even when we were apart, I always knew that you lived somewhere, and that thought always kept me going." Lucy smiled weakly, stroked her friend's hand with cold fingers, as if to comfort her or to say goodbye forever. Lucy was gone a few days later. Julia had to deal with the funeral and Emily. In the few days they spent together, Julia managed to befriend the girl. It wasn't hard. It turned out that Emily knew Aunt Julia well from her mom's stories, but now the little girl was not at all amused. She was still very young, but she knew that her mother was in trouble. Julia didn't know how to explain what had happened to her, so she just comforted her and promised that they would always be together. After burying her friend, she began to make arrangements for Emily's custody, who was an orphan. She didn't tell Emily that her mom was gone, but the girl realized it, especially when they moved to another town where Julia lived. She couldn't leave her job. So now she had to often remember Lucy's words that the profession of stewardesses is not suitable for a family man. She had to look for a nanny. Gradually, their life got better. The girl got used to it, and one day she asked, "Auntie, is that what it turns out, that you are now all the same to me as a mom?" "It turns out that way," Julia replied. "Of course, no one can replace Mom. But what can you do if that's the way it turns out? After all, your mom and I weren't related either. But we became the closest of people because we simply loved each other." Emily accepted the news and soon began calling Julia Mom. She also knew where her new mom worked. She soon told her that she would like to fly an aeroplane too. Julia understood this ambition of the girl. All children like to experience new things. And she promised that one day she would definitely take her with her. "You see, it's not just up to me out there. You have to get other people to let me take you." "Here," you ask them, "please tell them I've never flown and I really want to, and I'll behave very well. I won't bother anyone." Julia, wanting to please the little girl, made arrangements and took her on a flight one day. Emily was delighted. She was really well behaved, remembered all her mom's instructions. But one day there was an unpleasant incident. Passing through the business class cabin, she suddenly looked carefully at some man, as if trying to recognize him, and then rushed to this passenger with a shout. "Daddy, it's you. Daddy, where have you been?" and the little girl ran up to the passenger, who looked completely dazed and even frightened, and climbed into his lap. "I didn't even recognize you at once. Why are your hair like that? Did you dye them?" The girl reached for the man's lush hair, grabbed at his hair, and the hair pulled to the side. It turned out to be a wig, which she nearly yanked off his head. "What is this? Whose baby is this?" The man shouted indignantly, fixing his hair. "Take this girl away. I don't know her." An alarmed Julia ran up to the passenger, started apologizing, saying it was the unfortunate child's mistake. "I'm sorry, please. Her father died a year ago, and then her mom, so the girl thought you were her daddy. Don't be angry with her, please. Forgive me too. I understand and I'm ready to forgive. But you still have to watch the children. What is this?" Jumping on other people's laps, grabbing their hair, grumbled a passenger in the back room. Julia sternly reprimanded her daughter. "What's got into you, sweetheart? How can you behave like that? You frightened your uncle." "It's not uncle, it's my papa," cried the little girl. "He left us then, and now he even pretends not to know me. Mummy, why does he do that?" "So it's probably not your daddy. You've made a mistake. There are lots of similar people." "No, I'm not wrong. He's not similar, he is my dad. But since he is, I won't recognize him either," Emily reassured herself. Julia went on with her work, and the incident still lingered in her mind. The passenger Emily had mistaken for her father was with a woman, and the couple appeared to be very wealthy. But Emily's father could not boast of wealth. Besides, he was dead and even buried. But as far as Julia knew, the corpse had not been identified because it had been badly burned. And now this man in a wig. It was all rather strange. And strange it had been to Julia from the start. Why did her friend's husband never like to be photographed? It was as if he was hiding on purpose, trying to remain inconspicuous. She did not chase these thoughts away. They persisted in her head. But you couldn't go up to this man, already upset by Emily's antics, and ask him if he was Norman. Especially if he's trying so hard to hide his identity, he might not be Norman anymore. However, one could puzzle over it as much as he wanted and to no avail. So when the flight was over, the passengers disembarked. Julia walked through the business class cabin and noticed that under the seat where the man was sitting there was a purse. Apparently he had dropped it and hadn't even noticed it. Julia picked it up, opened it, and saw the documents. She remembered that her friend's husband's name was Norman Smith, and the papers were in the name of David Johnson's. Now we'll check it out, Julia thought. The purse also had the owner's phone number, which she had called, reporting a found purse that she wanted returned. "Oh, thank you so much. I was getting scared," the man rejoiced. "Where can we meet? I'll be sure to thank you." "That won't be necessary at all. I don't need other people's things," Julia assured him, and set up a meeting in a crowded place near the local supermarket. She recognized the passenger at once, but did not go to him, but waited until he was in the same place. Then she called out in the back, "Norman Smith." The man flinched, turned round. It was clear that he recognized his name. "Good afternoon," she said, approaching. So Emily was not mistaken. "You are indeed her father. But then why all this hoax? You do realize that by your death you have broken your daughter's heart, and thus brought Lucy's death nearer." "What are you saying?" hesitated the man, trying to hide his consternation behind irritation. "You must be mad. I can see now what your daughter is like. I don't know any Lucy, Emily, and I don't want to know you. I'm not Norman. You've seen my papers." He snatched the wallet from Julia's hands and hurried away. What does it mean, then, that she had found out? That was Lucy's husband. But then whose burnt bones were in his car? So on whose grave was poor Lucy weeping, tearing her aching heart? What should Julia do now? Go to the police? But with what? What charges? All she knows is that Emily recognized him as her daddy. But what does the testimony of a 5-year-old mean? However, it's probably not right to leave things as they are. Before Julia could make any decision, she felt she was being watched. Not noticed, but felt someone's constant presence, and it was extremely unsettling. Have I jeopardized both myself and my daughter with my discovery? She thought. Now Julia tried not to leave Emily alone. Julia wondered. What did I take a holiday for? One day, as she and Emily were walking home in the evening, they came across an elderly man who was obviously unwell. The girl walked over and tried to ask him what was wrong, but the stranger didn't answer. "Mum, are we really going to leave Granddad here?" Emily asked pitifully. "You're right, daughter, it's no good. Our house is quite close by. Come on, you'll feel better there." "Maybe we can call the doctors there," Julia replied. Grandpa agreed. At home he drank hot tea, had a snack, and told his sad story. Doctors should not be called or they will send to such a hospital, from which one way to the other side of the world. I've lost my memory. Some bums found me in a ditch with a broken head. But I don't think I've always been marginalized. What to do? I've forgotten everything. But all right, stay with us for now, Julia allowed, wondering deep down that she was surrounded by mysterious and most likely criminal stories since some time. She allowed her guest to wash and tidy up and noticed that it wasn't that old yet, but quite a sturdy man. "Crazy. I live alone with a child, and at night I drag a strange man into the house," Julia thought confusedly. But she couldn't kick him out, mainly because of Emily, who was the first to feel pity for the man and already called him Grandpa, treating him to various dishes. And Julia herself saw that the guest's eyes were kind, not making her suspect something bad about the man in trouble. "You must persuade him to see a doctor tomorrow," she thought. And then the doorbell rang. Julia was not frightened, not surprised. Her neighbor was just about to drop in. So, without asking anything or looking through the peephole, she just opened the door and froze in horror. There he was, Emily's father. Only now he didn't look scared or confused. This time his face was contorted with such anger and hatred that his intentions were clear without words. Julia froze with fear for the first minute, but then she realized the main thing, to get the scoundrel away from the child at least. She stepped towards the comer, forcing him out of the flat, but he pushed her back. "No, dearie. This isn't the way it's going to work. We'll talk inside. And don't you dare make any noise. Said if you want the girl alive," he hissed angrily. "She's your daughter, isn't she?" Julia whispered. "She's been through enough as it is." "That's fine, so you won't get used to it. You be quiet. It would be quick and bloodless." Iron hands squeezed Julia's neck. She realized that the villain had decided to strangle her, but now she couldn't scream. She only staggered backwards, knocking over a shoe cabinet. Emily and the guest came out to the noise. Everyone, no more witnesses could be dispensed with. "What's going on here?" the tramp exclaimed sternly. Removing an unwanted witness, Norman explained, loosening his grip slightly. "Do you want to take part, Grandpa?" "Absolutely," said the older man, and his fist was stamped lightning fast into the assassin's face. He had not expected such a leap from a seemingly harmless man. The man was quick to use some other techniques as well. Soon Norman was lying on the floor with his hands clasped behind his back. "The police should be called and the kid taken away," Grandpa said to Julia, who was coughing as she leaned against the wall. He himself was also hurt. It turned out that the failed murderer, not hoping apparently for a favorable outcome for himself, had also armed himself with a knife, which he tried to use. The guest's shirt at his side was quickly soaked with blood. Julia, after sending a frightened Emily to her room, quickly called the police and an ambulance. "So there's nothing to be done now. Do you need a doctor?" she asked the tramp. The ambulance and police arrived quite quickly. Grandpa was taken to the hospital, Norman to the police, where Julia now had to go to give her statement. Emily's father, it must be said, had been cleared up quite quickly. He had long been a wanted man. Marriage to Lucy was just a way for him to sit back, as well as to build up credit and escape, for which purpose the accident had been played out. Those remains that were recognized as his belonged to one of his associates, whom Norman had killed at the same time. But all these criminal stories were no longer of much interest to Julia. It was clear that the scoundrel would now be convicted, and nothing more would threaten her and her daughter. She was much more worried about her savior, who was now in hospital. Emily mentioned the grandfather who had saved her and her mum several times a day. The doctor said that he was not so badly hurt, just lost a lot of blood, and therefore still weak. It also turned out that he was wanted. However, it was not the police who were looking for him, but his son, who had been trying for weeks to find out where his father had disappeared to. He traveled to all hospitals and morgues and left his father's photo everywhere. So the doctors had no trouble identifying the unknown patient as Mr. Carl, the one the son was looking for. He, Andrew, received a phone call and rushed to the hospital, just as Julia was sitting at the bedside. Mr. Carl, who was not even that old, had not yet regained his memory. He did not immediately recognize his son. Julia, on the other hand, having met Andrew, a nice, well-dressed young man, told him exactly how his father had suffered. "I'm so glad I at least know his name now, and that you found him," she said sincerely. "There you go, Mr. Carl. You'll be all right now." "I hope so, only I can't remember anything." "I'm sorry, lad, but so far Julia and her daughter are dearer to me than you," confessed the patient. "And I'm sure you'll remember everything now. And I hope you don't forget Emily and I's address. Andrew, you tell me, and I'll sit back and listen too. It's very interesting to know what happened to Mr. Carl." In fact, she did not stay out of curiosity. Her recent encounter with the con man had made her distrustful. She feared for her savior. But she did listen to a story about a prominent businessman, Mr. Carl, who had gone to an important negotiation and disappeared. Apparently he had been robbed, but he couldn't remember anything. The son then began to recount his life and his father's life. Everything he remembered about his childhood, about his mother who had passed away early. At one point, tears flowed from Mr. Carl's eyes. The man who began to remember everything was interrupted by the doctor, who entered and asked the visitors to leave the room. "Can't you see that the patient is tired? He is already very weak, and you are aggravating his condition," the doctor said. Julia and Andrew walked out. Julia could hardly hold back her tears either. She was very touched by the young man's memories. He asked her not to forget her father and to visit them, and asked to meet him himself. "I too am very eager to know what happened to my father before and after the attack. Only you can tell that," Andrew said. But Julia realized from the look in his eyes that he was interested in more than that. He was clearly interested in her. And Julia agreed. She liked this guy too. Besides, it had been so long since she'd had a date after all she'd been through. She wanted to distract herself, to talk to someone with a positive attitude. The date was a success. This time Julia talked about her life, how she became a foster mom, about her friend who had passed away prematurely. A relationship had developed between them, and to meet Mr. Carl after his discharge from the hospital they came as a couple, together with Emily. The little girl had also recovered from the experience and met her grandfather with enthusiasm. So it is not without reason that they say that everything that happens is for the best. Looking at them, Mr. Carl rejoiced. "Only I've got a lot of work to do. I feel I've let things go," he said. "But not so much run down. I'm aware of it, too. I tried to make sure everything was in order when you got back," Andrew reassured his father. It probably was. Soon Andrew and Julie announced their decision to marry. Everyone was delighted with the outcome. And Mr. Carl didn't spare any expense. He arranged a fancy wedding for the young people. Running away from ungrateful children into the wilderness, Margaret found a photo in the attic. The school's small assembly hall was filled with students in resplendent prom dresses and fancy suits with tied ribbons. They took turns on the stage, where a tall, formidable woman with a joyful smile of the principal handed them their diplomas. A short woman in dark glasses and a long green dress stood next to her. She hugged everyone who received the cherished book and cried on their shoulder. "The gold medal for excellent studies goes to Margaret Swan," the principal said loudly into the microphone. A skinny girl in a red dress, in the color of her certificate, and with a long white braid, rose from the hall and headed to the stage. She was given a medal, red certificates, and a small bunch of flowers. The girl went up to her class teacher, a woman in a long green dress. "My dear child, how happy I am for you." The woman hugged Margaret. "You have a brilliant future ahead of you. I'm sure you are smart, kind, purposeful. You will definitely achieve everything you want. Do you understand?" The girl often nodded and hugged her class teacher. "Thank you for everything." Margaret came down from the stage and sat down in the hall, continuing to watch the awarding of certificates. Suddenly someone jumped up to her and whispered something in her ear. Margaret opened her eyes wide and jumped up from her seat. She had decided to leave the child in the orphanage. "Do you understand?" shouted the girl's mother. "We must do something, not sit here." "Let's go," ordered Margaret, and they ran towards the house, which was not far away. The girl ran into the house and saw her older sister, who had already packed a bag for the baby and was holding the girl in her arms. Vivi, what are you going to do? You're not just going to leave this girl at the orphanage, are you? Margaret asked hopefully, looking at her sister, who had gathered her long dark hair into a thick braid and was wearing a tracksuit. She was unattractive now, not like herself, the usually bright and stately girl around whom crowds of boys hovered. You don't understand. Margaret. Vivi shook the baby. It's what keeps me from living my life. It's draining me of all my strength, and it's screaming all the time. And I can't take it anymore, Vivi said indignantly. It's driving me crazy, making me act like I'm a freak. Margaret approached her sister slowly, shaking her head. It's her, not it. How do you not understand? It's a child. You can't just do that to it. You can't abandon her, you can't put her in an orphanage, do you understand? The girl said almost pitifully. Then take her for yourself. Vivi put the crying girl in Margaret's arms. Spare me the screaming and the crying and all that. I don't want it. I don't want to hear her howling every night. Without hearing her sister's reply, Vivi walked over and shoved the bag with the baby's things into her hands. Look, you can't leave her, Margaret exclaimed, looking into the girl's big blue eyes. What do you mean I can't? I can give her anywhere the social workers. It doesn't make any difference. The baby cried and Margaret began to rock her, trying to soothe her. When she looked up, her sister was gone. Only the wind blew from the ajar door. 25 years later, a large wall clock struck 6 in the morning. The hand indicated the early hour, when everyone who didn't have to get up early for work was asleep. But Margaret was already at the stove, cooking oatmeal and scrambled eggs. Kieran didn't eat porridge, he liked eggs with bacon. His loving mother was trying to please his tastes. Kieran and Matthew had to be up early for work at 8 in the morning, and Margaret had to leave half an hour earlier. So they had to get up at 6 to make breakfast, iron shirts, and walk the dog. The dog ran up to his mistress, wagging his tail merrily. Margaret wasn't really his owner. Kira had gotten him for herself, but then she'd married Andrew, who was allergic to fur. That's how, completely unnoticed, the poor animal ended up in a small 2-room apartment. After finishing her chores, Margaret began to get ready for work. She was an ordinary school teacher, teaching geography in a small school. Since childhood, she had dreamed of traveling. However, life happened, so that she had only seen other countries in pictures and textbooks. Traveling to work took Margaret a lot of time. She rode a bicycle because she did not have a car. The family had 2 cars, one for Matthew and one for Kieran. Margaret helped them buy these cars. Matthew was the first to get a used car for his 18th birthday. But soon his younger brother envied him. The woman had to take a loan to please her favorite son. Mom, of course, they did not drive to work, they were waiting for a hard day's work, which required rest and sleep. In good weather, Margaret would ride her bicycle to work, but in snow or rain she could take the bus. Margaret had a best friend, the energetic Stacy. They had met at school when Margaret came to apply for a job as a geography teacher after college. Stacy taught biology and often visited her friend to chat about life and discuss the latest news. This day was no exception. When Margaret arrived at the school, she learned that the 11th graders had been taken away to prepare for the last bell, so she had no class. Stacy, who had handed out test papers to the noisy 5th graders, had quietly retired to a nearby office to check the exam schedule. She caught Margaret checking her notebooks. "Girlfriend, do you ever get any rest?" she asked. Margaret lifted her big blue eyes and removed her glasses from her face. She looked at her friend with a mixture of squint and bewilderment. "I didn't have time to check on the house last night. I'd stayed up late cleaning the bathroom. Then I had to wash the stain on Matthew's white shirt. He likes it very much," Margaret said. "What time did you go to bed?" Stacy asked lazily, anticipating the answer. She had known Margaret for years and was aware of all her household chores. Margaret shrugged her shoulders, put her notebook aside, and stood up from the table. "Would you like some tea?" She nodded at the kettle. Stacy nodded. 2:00, I think. I can't remember, to be honest. Kieran was up late watching some really interesting movie, and I couldn't sleep, Margaret admitted. Stacy rolled her eyes. "I still can't understand why you're sleeping in the same room as Kieran while Matthew is alone." Aren't kids supposed to be in the same room? She muttered. And they're hardly children. They're not thinking of moving out of their mother's house. They're both well into their third decade. Margaret shook her head and remained silent. She thought her friend's talk was nonsense. Stacy herself had married much later than Margaret and had had a daughter 15 years ago. It was certainly not her place to talk about such things. "How's Digit?" Stacy asked, putting sugar in her mug. Margaret shrugged. "She and Andrew had a fight the other day. I don't know how things are going over there. I try to stay out of their lives. You know she should be very grateful to you," Stacy said with a bit of pressure. "Why would I put that in my head? Margaret was the only one who got the hint. You're too good a mom for her." Margaret shrugged her shoulder uncertainly, slightly embarrassed. She understood what Stacy meant, and she hated that her friend had brought up such an unpleasant subject. "How's your Joshua? He sent me some pictures from the university the other day. I'll show you." Stacy smiled and reached for her cell phone, which was full of pictures of her nephew at the university in the capital. Margaret came home before her sons for the first time in a long time. Usually she stayed up late with her failing students or checked a mountain of notebooks. Today she excused an 8th grade boy in honor of his birthday and left the notebooks behind. Then the next day, her daughter called and asked to meet. Kira didn't see her mother often, and this was an event for Margaret. She hurried home to make her daughter's favorite pie. Kira arrived early. Margaret had not yet had time to take the pie out of the oven when the doorbell rang. The woman hurried to open it, trying not to trip over the cachapuri running around her former landlady. On the threshold stood her tall, red-haired daughter in a beautiful red dress. The girl smiled at her mother and threw herself around her neck, comfortably intercepting the box of chocolates. "Mommy, I'm so happy to see you," Kira said enthusiastically. "What smells so good?" Margaret smiled and called into the kitchen. "Guess if it's my favorite cherry pie?" "Mommy, you're great." The girl rushed into the kitchen, petting the dog on the way. Margaret hurried to take the pie out of the oven before it burned. Kira started making tea. "How are you two doing?" Margaret asked, cutting into the steaming, flavorful pie. Kira smiled broadly and shrugged her shoulders. "Andrew and I made up. He gave me 27 roses in honor of the number of months we've been together, and then he took me to a rooftop restaurant. You should have seen how beautiful it was." Margaret smiled, happy for her daughter, and put the cake on the table. She sat down on a stool. Kira set out several fragrant mugs of tea and sat down opposite, settling herself deftly. "I haven't called them in a while," Margaret shrugged, setting the pie down for herself and her daughter. "Kieran's studying, he's almost done his diploma. And Matthew? I think he's got a girlfriend. But he won't tell me anything, can you imagine? Though I don't bother." "That's right," Kira nodded. "He's a big boy now. We're only a year and a half apart. I think he already knows what he should do with a girl." Kira laughed. Margaret picked up her laughter and shook her head. "You know, Andrew and I have decided to take out a mortgage so we can have our own place," her daughter continued. "Soon we will have children, and it is difficult to raise them in a rented apartment." "Why are you making excuses?" Margaret exclaimed. "It's all right. I raised you in a foreign city, in an apartment that didn't belong to us. So having your own apartment is the right thing to do." "Are you saying that to share or to get my approval?" Kira asked, setting the mug aside. The smile came off her lips. She looked out the window, then at the leg of the kitchen table, and finally shifted her gaze to her mother. "It's not one thing or the other, you know. To get a mortgage, you need a down payment. Andrew and I don't have that kind of money right now." Margaret left her cup of tea too and looked at her daughter carefully. "Do you want me to give you money?" Kira shrugged his shoulders. "I know you have some. You'll buy for a vacation abroad. There's not only money for vacations, but for a rainy day." Margaret said slowly. The joy of her daughter's arrival had already waned, and the woman spoke with a note of sadness, foreshadowing an unpleasant conversation. "Do you want me to give you the last of my savings?" "Not exactly," Kira answered. "How can I explain to you that we need that money? We need a place to live. As soon as Andrew gets his bonus, we'll pay you back a part of it, and then." The woman raised her hand in front of her, asking her daughter to shut up, and pressed her lips together. She didn't like to say no to her daughter, couldn't stand saying no to her children, but sometimes she had to. "You haven't paid me back the money you borrowed for Andrew's car almost a year ago. You promised me that you'd give it all back to me with the bonus. And then it was vacation money too, the last one." Kira rolled her eyes. "Mom, you're being dramatic. You're the one who will remember every penny of it." Margaret grinned bitterly and shook her head. "I'm not reminiscing about every penny. I'm just asking you to be a little more attentive to your mother. You didn't even come to my birthday party. You forgot your brother's graduation and missed your grandmother's funeral." "I was working," Kira exclaimed. "So was I. But for some reason I always came to your birthday parties. And even when you and Andrew quarreled for the first time, and you sat and cried on the embankment in the rain, I took off work and came. Don't you remember that?" Kira looked away and pressed her lips together, just like her mother had done a few minutes ago. "So you won't give me the money then?" Margaret shook her head. Kira jumped up from her seat, nearly dropping her chair, and rushed to the door. "Thanks for your help, Mommy," the girl said, slamming the door. The woman lowered her head. Tears flowed from Margaret's eyes. She could no longer contain herself. Large salty drops fell on the white tablecloth. Her sobs could be heard throughout the apartment. Something clenched in the woman's chest, causing unbearable pain. In the evening, when Margaret had calmed down and was minding her own business, her sons returned. "Mom, are you home?" Nick called out. Margaret responded. From the kitchen, she was preparing dinner for her sons. "I asked you to iron the white shirt yesterday, and you ironed the blue one. Like a fool, I came to the open house alone in blue," Nick complained. The woman rolled her eyes tiredly. She probably would have tolerated it another time. But after her conversation with Kira, she'd been on edge. "The white one hung in the closet. It wasn't that hard to get it out and iron it. It would have taken a couple minutes. Was it hard for you to memorize my request?" she asked capriciously. Nick entered the kitchen. Margaret turned sharply in his direction and threw the towel back on the refrigerator. "You're almost 22 years old. You're a grown guy, running around dating girls and looking for a prestigious job. And you ask your mom to iron your damn shirt. Are you going to hide behind your mother's skirt for the rest of your life, just like your bad father?" said the woman loudly, throwing off her apron. "And you sleep in your brother's room now. I'm a grown woman and I want to spend my free time in peace, not listening to your conversations and watching movies at 2 a.m. Earthquakes are caused by the shifting of tectonic plates. The most seismically active zones in our country are Kamchatka and Sakhalin Island. There is also the largest volcano there, Klushevskaya Sopka. It is very dangerous to live there. There is a risk of an earthquake or volcanic eruption. Japan is also in a seismically active zone. Shifts of tectonic plates also cause the formation of large mountain massifs. The higher the mountain, the earlier it formed. So one plate is thrust over another," Margaret said slowly and measuredly, scrolling through her pen and occasionally looking out the window. Margaret liked to teach lessons, but sometimes she purposely forgot her homework and taught new material, ignoring the bustle and chatter of the students. There was a reason for that now. Her mind was reeling over the past day, and she couldn't figure out who was right and who was wrong. Margaret thought she had been too harsh with the children. After all, it wasn't Vincent's fault that she had forgotten about the white shirt. Kira was just beginning her adult life, and she needed her parents' support. Besides, comparing her son to his father was wrong. Margaret was sure she'd managed to raise her sons differently from their father, who'd abandoned the family for another woman. Vincent did sleep in his brother's room. In the morning, Margaret didn't say anything to them, and, resentful, went to work to check the notebooks left over from the previous day. It seemed so wrong. But an inner voice, still offended by her daughter's words, argued that Margaret had done the right thing. The woman's musings were interrupted by the creak of the door, which slowly opened, and a short, blonde-haired boy entered the study. He tossed his backpack beside his desk and sat down, grinning and glaring at the teacher. Margaret, surprised at this insolence of a student, stood up from her desk to tower over the 8th grader. Someone started laughing. All thoughts of home and problems with the children immediately popped into Margaret's mind. She looked at the boy, at his grin and his cocky face, and immediately remembered her children, Kira's face when she'd heard her mother wouldn't give her money, Vincent's face when he'd wondered about the shirt. And the woman snapped. "Swan, get up from the table quickly," Margaret said sternly, "or your parents will be called to the school, and you'll be out of here immediately." She glared angrily at the student. Every movement, every sound, every smirk, and every movement made her dislike him. "Really?" The boy grinned. "Do you know who my father is to talk like that?" "You spoiled Mama's boy, Swan." Margaret continued in a harsh tone. "Leave my office immediately," the boy said irritably. "What are you going to do? Drool on a child? You're a loser like all the teachers in this school, working for a pittance, dissatisfied with your life, hating children. I can tell you haven't had a man in a long time, Margaret." Margaret opened her mouth and gasped with indignation. Her hands clenched into fists. She looked at the boy and saw only evil incarnate. The woman grabbed the schoolboy's backpack with one hand, his ear with the other, and hurried toward the door. She almost threw the boy into the hallway, then threw his briefcase after him, which hit the concrete floor and the contents spilled out. "Get out, you little rascal," shouted the woman. "Shove your insolence where you belong, and don't you dare come to this office again. You nasty, brainless boy." Margaret slammed the door angrily. To her surprise, there were shocked teachers standing in the hallway. The woman shifted her gaze to the children and saw the frightened looks on their faces. They looked at her with fear, clutching at their desks. Margaret sighed and returned to her seat. The students ducked into their books. After all that had happened, Margaret pondered the boy's words. He had a point. The teachers at the school worked for low wages, tolerated the insolent remarks of the students, and were unhappy with their lives. Every day she watched herself, Stacy, and the other co-workers. They were all terribly tired, with lots of problems at home and at school. Someone who had succumbed to life's hardships, the kids were afraid. Some who chose tactics of indifference, the kids loved. The second option belonged to those teachers who happily went home, letting the children go home a few lessons early, not conducting tests and talking to them on extraneous topics. Oh yes, those kids loved them. True. Then in colleges and universities they cried about not knowing English or physics. The reason was the teachers who chose their peace. But those who tried to give children knowledge were not loved. And Margaret was one of those who tried to combine the two tactics. Margaret meekly tolerated the attacks of students like that blonde-haired, bald-headed boy Swan. She went along when kids asked to be let off early on Fridays, or the last day of the quarter, while still trying to teach lessons and provide knowledge. The woman never thought the day would come when her kindness would only lead to trouble. There were few students like Swan, but the few that did take advantage of her teacher's kindness grew more and more insolent as time went on. The school disliked teachers most of all because of such children, and they turned into strict, uncompromising people who wanted only to leave their hated jobs as soon as possible. Swan, however, was a special case. His father, a local politician, had a lot of power and initially gave his son to a prestigious school, where everything was presented to such children on a platter. However, after another scandal involving the son of the mayor of a neighboring town, in order to save his place, the politician had to transfer the boy to a regular school. Of course, at first Swan was difficult to adapt, but he soon realized that you can trump the influence of his father and actively used it. Teachers let him get away with everything, children avoided him, and everything was relatively calm. Until Margaret took umbrage she was in a bad mood because of personal problems. On a normal day, I would probably have gently reprimanded the boy for being late so as not to create conflict, she thought. But this time I couldn't help myself. After class, as Margaret was about to go home, she was called to her office by the principal on the school radio. Those teachers who were still in the school saw the woman off with pity as she walked down the corridor. One even patted her on the shoulder. Joshua knocked on the open door and Margaret stepped inside. The principal was a short, gray-haired old man with a bald spot on his head, sitting in a high office chair, rubbing his forehead with a wrinkled hand. He looked up at the teacher who entered and put on his half-rimmed glasses, looking at her carefully. Margaret, "Hello." Joshua said hello and pointed to a chair in front of the desk. Margaret nodded and sat down. "Is this about Swan?" Joshua nodded. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I remember you as a girl when you came in after college with a baby in your arms. I remember everything you did for the school. But you realize we don't need conflict with a powerful man. How did you even get that boy out of your office by force? That's not like you." Margaret lowered her head low and sighed. "I'm sorry, Joshua. It's just that I'm having problems at home and a bad day." And he's been saying things like that. Margaret sighed, trying to hold back tears. Joshua held out a glass of water and shook his head. He folded his wrinkled hands on the table, squeezing them into a lock with force. "I'd love to keep this thing quiet, but you have to realize the school doesn't want trouble with his powerful father. We'll lose funding and be plagued with inspections. All the teachers will be sent in for background checks. It's easier for me to leave the school," Margaret concluded quietly, taking a drink of water. Resentment and despair squeezed her throat, cutting off her oxygen supply. The woman was almost out of breath. The school was part of her life. She'd worked there for over 20 years. The office, the children, the lessons, the notebooks, it all seemed so familiar. It couldn't be otherwise. And now that part was being taken away from her, leaving her soul torn to shreds. "I'll let you leave on your own. I'll try to keep the conflict quiet so the details don't get out beyond the walls of the school. But you realize it's hard to hide something like this. Everyone will talk, and the kids will bring other stories to their parents. If you ever want to work in a school, it won't be in our town." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and memories of days gone by flashed before her. She could clearly see the day she had to leave her hometown so that she and Kira could have a normal life. History was repeating itself. The town where she had raised 3 children, found friends, a job, and co-workers had to be left. It was as if fate mocked her every time life seemed to fall into place. With a black pen left over from her exams, Margaret wrote a letter of resignation. Her sprawling teacher's signature flaunted on the white sheet, letting the woman know that this was the end. The end of normal life, the end of everything she had. "Can I take my things back?" the woman asked quietly. Joshua nodded. "Sure, Margaret, you can come say goodbye to the kids, to your co-workers. Maybe when this boy graduates, you'll be able to go back again." "Thank you, Joshua," Margaret nodded. "I'm grateful for the kindness, for all you've done for me." When Margaret came to work at the school, Joshua was the vice principal and physics teacher. He treated with kindness the young girl, who was not even 20 when she came to work before she had finished her studies. He helped her get on the waiting list for housing for a young family. He let her go when Kira was sick, stayed with her during maternity leave, and helped the young girl in many ways. Margaret was grateful to him for that. With a stone in her heart, Margaret went into the study to retrieve her things and a few books. She was followed in by Stacy, who, only seeing her friend's hard stare, shook her head. She immediately realized what had happened. "The principal gave me time to pack and say goodbye. He's wrong. It's not your fault what happened. We all wanted to do that to that underling, Stacy. I forced him out into the hallway, and he fell to the concrete floor. Thank God he didn't hurt himself. Not only would I have been sued, but I wouldn't have been able to forgive myself." Margaret exhaled and sat back in her seat, covering her face with her hands. I understand that this is a difficult situation for Margaret. The fact that she was given the opportunity to resign is not a bad thing, because many people would have been fired with a reprimand on their record for such an incident. Stacy walked over to her friend and lightly hugged her from behind. She rested her head on her shoulder for moral support. "The house is a mess," Margaret said. "I had a fight with Jessica. She asked for money for the mortgage. I said no. It's all because of that. You see, if I'd given the money, everything would have been all right. But no. Nothing would have been okay," Stacy replied sharply. "They're adults, and they're sitting on your neck. You couldn't stand it, if not now, then later. And you need to start your life without them. They're your kids, I get it, but you don't have to give them all of yourself. You've done too much for them already, especially for her." Margaret shook her head, staring down at her desk. She saw notebooks, textbooks, pens, and a newspaper. The woman grabbed it and shoved it at the pages of advertisements. Look, Margaret jabbed her finger at a small ad on the last page. There's a cabin for sale cheap in the next county. This village borders the town where my grandmother lived. She died a long time ago, but I remember how beautiful it was there. So buy it. Stacy exclaimed. I know you have the money, and you could almost go back to your hometown. It's right next to your hometown. Margaret nodded. You can start a new life away from the children of powerful people who don't know how to raise them. Do you think it's worth it? The peace of mind, Margaret asked thoughtfully. Yes, replied Stacy with conviction. Stacy's husband, Jason, helped Margaret move things into her new home. The woman had packed everything up while the children were out of the house. She left them a short note and left, determined to start a new life. It seemed so strange at 40+ years old to start over. Stacy didn't understand her friend's worries, but she kept cheering her up. The house was not far from Margaret's hometown. A 40-minute bus ride would take her to the cemetery where her mother and father were buried. I realized that for Margaret it was a difficult but exciting start to a new chapter in her life. Although the cottage seemed a little dilapidated, it had potential. Jason said it could be repaired, the roof could be fixed, the kitchen floor could be redone. There was gas, the walls were solid, and there was even some furniture left. The man shifted his gaze to the broken chair Stacy sat in. Almost whole, he grinned. How's your money doing? Jason asked. Margaret shrugged. I spent most of it on the house, of course, and haven't added to my savings in a while. However, it will be enough for the first time. Maybe I can even pay for the roof repairs. Do you think that's expensive? Jason scratched the back of his head and looked at the roof. If you hire a crew, it's not cheap. But you can find local men in the village and they'll do it cheaper. The main thing is not to hire drunks, they will sing more than work. Margaret grinned. I'll know. Okay, thank you guys. You've been a big help. Stacy waved goodbye to her friend and got in her car. She had to get to the rehearsal for the 9th grade prom. Margaret stepped out of the house and looked around more closely. It was small, 4 rooms, a bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and a hall. There was also a small porch, but it was a summer porch. Consider it for a separate room, she thought. It seemed to the woman that she was very lucky to buy a house for such a small amount of money. When she asked the seller why it was so cheap, he said that the village was dying out. The school might be closed soon. No one wants to buy houses there. Besides, he had gotten the house by chance from a deceased great-aunt, so he didn't value it much. There was a lot of work to be done to improve the house, but Margaret was ready for it. She was alone at last. Margaret spent more than 3 days cleaning the old house. On the 4th, she left the most difficult part of the job, the attic. She was afraid to go up there. It didn't look safe, and it was much dirtier than the other rooms. It looked like no one had been up there in 20 years, if not more. The woman set her bag down beside her and slowly climbed through the trapdoor in the ceiling. Margaret almost fell in, but when she found herself at the top, she realized there was more work than she thought. The attic was full of boxes and old trunks where women had stored their belongings long ago. Margaret decided to start sorting through the boxes to throw away anything that wasn't needed. Rolling up her sleeves, she sighed and sat down on the dusty floor. The first 3 boxes were of women's things. The 4th contained children's toys. Margaret took them apart at first, winding up dolls and wiping down dusty cars. But then she gave up the useless endeavor and left the box. Another box had albums of photographs. Margaret leafed through them, marveling at the happiness of the people in the pictures, and set them aside. The farthest box was small and light. Margaret opened it and aghast. On the very top was a wooden frame containing a picture of her sister Vivi and a strange guy. They were hugging and looking happily into the camera lens. Vivi, Margaret whispered with shaky hands, snatching the photo away. The girl looked exactly as she remembered her long, thick black hair, dark eyes, sharp facial features, and a narrow nose. Margaret hadn't seen her sister in over 25 years. She was sure she was dead. Seeing a picture of Vivi happy seemed very strange and brought bitterness to her soul. Margaret pulled out the frame and saw a small wooden box with 2 letters VI carved into it. The woman unlocked it and saw a small pendant in the shape of a scarab beetle and a Vera pendant. Underneath it lay another photograph. This picture only showed a guy in uniform. On the back was written the year. Margaret gasped in surprise. The year of her daughter's birth. The man was smiling. A letter lay next to it. Margaret unfolded it and, smiling, began to read the lines. Dear Vivi, I am writing to you, hoping for a reply. You have not answered for so long that I was afraid something had happened to you. Grandma should be coming to visit soon. I hope you'll be with her. I missed you madly. Your hair the color of night and your piercing eyes that looked straight into my soul. I can't live without the touch of your velvet skin. A day without you is agony, and I haven't seen you in 5 months. I miss our moonlit lounges and long late-night conversations. I hope all is well with you. Your lover. Margaret sighed sadly. This seemed to be the child's father. There were others under that envelope. With each letter, Alex grew more and more worried. He wrote that he missed her and couldn't be without Vivi. In the last letter he wrote, Grandma was in the other day and told me that you went to your house and never came back. I have no idea what happened. Probably you found someone else richer or prettier. I don't know. I hope you're happy. In case you're wondering, I've decided to stay in the army on a contract. You probably won't read this. I don't know your new address, so I'm writing to my grandmother's address. Alex. Alex seemed to really love Vivi. However, she wasn't there for her. She needed something else, not just love. She was looking for something different. Margaret went downstairs. She didn't want to read the letters anymore. It bored her. She felt sorry for Alex. He wrote such beautiful lines. About Vivi. Vivi was her own person. All the years as the older sister, she had acted like she was a couple years younger than Margaret. The then still young girl had to deal with her problems and hide their consequences from her ailing father. If something happened to Vivi, everyone ran to Margaret, and she dealt with all the problems. A broken window, missing money from her father's stash, late returns, and more. Vivi never thought about the feelings of others. Alex was no exception. Margaret cooked potatoes and cucumbers she'd bought from her neighboring grandmother on the old, salted stove and sat down to dinner. The food, however, did not go down her throat. She looked at the seemingly appetizing potatoes and cucumbers, but could not swallow a bite. Everything seemed terribly bland and unpalatable. The reason for this was thoughts of her sister. Margaret hadn't seen her sister in over 25 years. She didn't even know if Vivi was still alive. Now her conscience began to plague her for that. Vivi was her sister, whatever she was, and so she couldn't just abandon her. We have to find her, Margaret said firmly, and took a bite of cucumber. A clear plan formed in Margaret's mind. She saw no obstacle to finding her sister. The letters had stirred her soul. The next morning, Margaret went upstairs to go through the boxes looking for something that might help find Vivi. There was nothing useful in the letters. At the very bottom of one of the boxes, however, was an old notebook with lots of numbers and addresses in it. The numbers were probably invalid. It had been so long, but the addresses could be verified. Margaret could safely say that the book belonged to her sister. She could recognize Vivi's crooked handwriting from 1,000 sprawling letters in the long, intricate curls. At the very end of the book was a name, Diakova Janie. Next to the name was written, Call. Help. Vivi had a habit of signing everything she could so she wouldn't forget. She always carried a notebook with her and wrote in it the names of suitors, the places and times she met them, so she wouldn't get them mixed up. Margaret had laughed at this habit before, but now she realized there was nothing wrong with it. She tore out the sheet with Janie's name on it and stuffed it in her pocket. Sure, it had been a while, but maybe this Janie could help find Vivi. The woman finished all the chores around the house. She asked her neighbors for the best bus ride to the address in the book and planned the trip. She left early the next day. Margaret was glad to be back in her hometown, to walk through familiar places from her childhood, and to remember the past. The woman walked past the school and smiled as she saw the windows of her class and remembered her graduation. She had been predicted a successful future then. Margaret knew what university she was going to attend and was seriously preparing for the exams. And then what happened happened. The house she needed to go to was on the very outskirts of the city. The poorest families lived in that neighborhood. In Margaret's class, only 2 classmates were from that neighborhood. They walked around in shabby clothes and often bruised. Both dropped out of school after 9th grade and moved into the dormitory. Margaret hoped that their lives were better than during their high school years. The basement where Janie's apartment was supposed to be was doorless. Margaret walked slowly inside, looking around cautiously. "We'll put it up soon," said the man smoking on the bench hoarsely. He smelled foul, probably of alcohol and cheap cigarettes. Margaret smiled, nodded, and quickly went inside before the man said anything more. The entryway had the same odor as a smoker, with a dash of urine scents. The woman sighed and headed for the third floor. The apartment she was looking for had to be there. There was no elevator, of course. Apartment 11 was on the third floor. It had a massive metal door with obscene writing on it. The bell was recessed into the wall. Margaret pressed the button and carefully removed her hand. It was unknown if it worked or not. A moment later, she heard heavy footsteps and grumbling outside the door. "Who's in there?" The door swung open. A tall, full woman with disheveled hair, wearing a laundered bathrobe with a grease stain on her chest, stood on the threshold. "Hello. Are you Janie Dakova?" Margaret smiled. "Why?" The woman looked her over from head to toe. "You see, I'm looking for my sister. Her name is Vivi. She wrote your address in her address book." The woman made an inarticulate, throaty sound and laughed. "I haven't heard from her in years. I owed her something, so I helped her about 30 years ago. Maybe less." "When was the last time you saw her?" Margaret asked. Janie shrugged. "I'm telling you, it was about 30 years ago. No, wait, about 25. The neighbor's little boy was still born then. His mom was here yelling when she went into labor that day. And we just celebrated his 25th birthday." "What did she want? Where'd she go?" Janie grumbled. "She came running, and everyone took off, asked for help finding a place to live. But I gave her the number of someone I knew who had a room for rent in a communal apartment in the neighborhood. She took it and ran." "Could you give me the address?" Margaret asked. Janie grinned and held out her hand. "We don't give out information for free." Margaret rolled her eyes but reached into her purse. She pulled out a 3-0 bill, handed it to the woman, and tilted her head. Janie went back into the house, tore a small slip from the wall calendar, and wrote the address on it in scrawled handwriting. "Here you are, Snow White. You're the only one who has nothing to catch there." The woman shrugged her shoulders. "Why not? I heard she got married, so I don't think she's ever been in this dump. It's been so many years yet." Margaret had been told that phrase too often lately. She braced herself, snatched the paper with the address out of the woman's hand, and walked away. "Thank you," Margaret mumbled politely. She wanted to wash up after being in that entryway, so she went home. She'd have time to go to the address. The next day, Margaret went to the school to ask about the vacancy. She had no intention of going home. Of course, the kids called her, but she didn't answer. That's what Stacy had said. Her opinion was one the woman usually listened to. Of course, it was heavy on her heart that she hadn't answered her sons. However, for the first time in a long time, the woman felt free. The school was small, 2-story, with windows open everywhere. May was hot, and there were children with countenances running in the street. Next to them was a short woman with white hair and wearing a long skirt. She was giving instructions and periodically approached the girls who were planting flowers. "Petrova, haven't you ever planted flowers? What is this? You should have covered it all the way with earth," the teacher said. Margaret chuckled softly and walked over to the woman. "Excuse me, could you tell me where the principal's office is?" she asked. "Good afternoon," the teacher smiled. "Are you someone's mom?" "Oh no, I wanted to get a job," Margaret replied. "My children are grown up now. I just moved to your village and I need a job. I thought you might have something here," Margaret told the teacher. "Are you a geographer by training?" "Oh, we have a vacancy for a geographer. But you could go and see Kieran Vincent and see what you can find. First floor, third office. Go in and walk straight ahead. His door's on the left. Don't miss it." Margaret nodded gratefully and went into the school. The principal's door was indeed where the woman had said. Margaret knocked. "Come in." came a muffled voice. "Hello, my name is Margaret Swan. I'm a geography teacher. I've just moved here and I need a job." Esmeralda nodded and smiled broadly. "My name is Esmeralda. I'm the headmistress. Sit down, tea, coffee?" Margaret shook her head and sat down. "The geographer's place is unfortunately taken. But we have a vacant place for a teacher of technology and labor. And you will hardly agree to teach Russian," Esmeralda clarified. Of course, Margaret nodded. "Isn't there a technology class there? Isn't it?" "Tana taught that. She's a biologist, but she can't work 2 jobs. You know, she teaches everyone biology, and she's the class teacher. She's also the head teacher. You know, it's a lot of work." "Then I could take the place of the technology teacher," Margaret smiled. "Would you?" Esmeralda shook her head. "There's no point in signing you up now. Let's start with the new school year. But you probably need a job right now, don't you?" "That would be nice," Margaret grinned, remembering how much money she had left in her account. "We're short a teacher at the day camp in July. Would you agree?" Margaret nodded. Esmeralda took out a blank sheet of paper and wrote something on it. "You will collect the list of documents, pass the commission, and you can come. I'm processing you. You're just in time. Wouldn't you know it, Margaret? They're going to close our school. You see, not enough students, not enough students, not enough teachers. But no. New people are coming to the village." Margaret smiled. "Yes, it's very beautiful here. If it's no secret, where did you move to?" "The 15th house on Oktyabrskaya Street," Margaret answered. "Tana's house. We remember her. She didn't have children of her own, but she always had a lot of kids coming to see her. Her nephews used to come. She'd invite the village kids, give them all a treat. She was a kind woman. May she rest in peace." "Don't you remember?" Esmeralda asked. "She didn't have a girl who lived here. About 25 years ago, tall, bald, with big eyes. And a girl like that. I remember Alex's fiancé, Tana's nephew. She was a strange girl. I never liked her. I was a little older myself. She was like, I don't know." "What's your point? Did you find the pictures in the attic?" Margaret shrugged and got up from her chair. "Thank you for your help, Esmeralda. I'm going to go get the paperwork together." Margaret cheerfully walked out of the school and headed home. She had a home, she almost had a job, and maybe soon she would find her sister. Suddenly something niggled inside, as if warning her. But the woman paid no attention. She only smiled at the sight of children running around the schoolyard. The house at the address Janie had given her was the same as her own, except there was a door in the entryway. On the bench sat a man exactly like the one at Janie's house. He was smoking a cigarette and glaring mockingly at Margaret. The woman seemed to be headed inside the apartment, which was on the 5th floor. Margaret climbed the stairs, the soles of her new sneakers sticking to them, and saw a door with 4 bells next to it. The woman was confused and rang the first one. A few seconds later, someone opened the door. "I'm not buying anything," said the old woman, whose voice I'm not selling. Grinning. The woman waved her hand in the direction of the house and went to cook dinner herself. Alex really stayed at Margaret's place. He ordered material for the fence and even fixed the roof. All morning he had been climbing on it, tapping and drilling. After lunch, he climbed down, clapped his hands together and said, "Take the job, mistress. It won't last forever, of course, but it'll do for a couple months." "Thank you. Let's go inside. I bought some kvass from my neighbor. Would you like some homemade?" Sure, the man smiled broadly, stretching his crescent-shaped scar. Every day Alex did something new in the house. Then he ate Margaret's lunches and praised them. It was a mandatory routine. The woman noticed that the uninvited neighbor was very good-looking. He's tall, trim, strong. He was also hardworking. Alex was nothing like Margaret's ex-husband. All he did was lie on the couch after a hard day's work. Every weekend he went to a bar with his friends. Even the day Matthew had a fever of 40 degrees was no exception. Margaret called an ambulance, and during the examination, her husband came back to the house, barely standing on his feet. He yelled at the doctor and then went to sleep in the middle of the living room. Margaret was terribly ashamed at the time, and the doctor advised her to leave such a husband. Margaret's new neighbor was quite different, sensitive and intelligent. He kept up conversations about books and various places. "I've been to Prague," he said. A co-worker had gone there, and I was visiting him. Margaret only smiled dreamily at the stories of various places. "I've always wanted to travel. But first there was Stacy, then Matthew, and then Vince. Besides, a teacher's salary doesn't really allow for traveling." "Why a teacher?" Alex asked and leaned back in his chair. He and Margaret were sitting across from each other in the living room. After a hard day, they were planting potatoes. Of course, it was late the end of May. But the neighbor gave a few buckets and said that if Margaret was going to stay living in the settlement, it was better to plant a vegetable garden. Alex, as usual, didn't stay away. "I wasn't going to go to pedagogy," Margaret admitted. But then Yuji showed up. "I blew the entrance exams, moved to another city to avoid the ridicule of the neighbors. And I went to the pedagogy school there as a part-time student. I barely graduated and went to work. That's the secret. I love being around kids, but it's hard. I got kicked out for throwing a student out into the hallway by force." There was a whistling sound in the room. Alex shook his head in surprise. "Are you serious? That was wrong. I will try to do the editing of the text, keeping it close to the original and following your instructions." Margaret shook her head. "Besides, he was the son of a judge. I also screwed over the school I worked at. Either you have a demon inside you, or that boy was that bad at geography." The woman thought back sadly to that day. "Geography had nothing to do with it," she said. "He was just cocky and overconfident, and I was too upset and angry. But, everything that's done is done for the best, isn't it? I found my sister, and you ended up without a daughter. Yeah, it's definitely for the best." There was silence, which was broken only by the sound of an insect flying around the room. Alex couldn't find anything to say, so he just kept silent. Alex and Margaret grew closer. They sat and talked more and more often. In the evenings, he talked about the war and the army, she about children and school. Sometimes they went to help an old lady neighbor who rarely had children over. First they cleaned her house, then they helped in the vegetable garden. Alex also fixed her fence. The old lady was very grateful and gave the helpers a can of milk and a bag of pies. One day at the end of June, Alex, realizing that Margaret would be returning in the dark, went after her. He met her in the middle of the road. "Why are you here?" "It's dark," he said. "I thought you were scared." "Today is the 21st, Margaret said, as if it meant something. "It's the day of the shortest night of the year. It'll be light before you get home, won't it? But I'm scared to be home alone." Margaret laughed. She knew she liked Alex, and she knew he liked her, but she didn't know what the outcome of their affection would be. The blue night sky was covered in a scattering of 1,000,000 stars, and at the very top was a bright, full, warm moon, lighting the path so brightly it felt like it was daytime outside. "When you showed up at my compound and started talking about your sister, I thought you were just like her," Alex started to say suddenly. "A hypocritical bitch and cruel. But then I saw how upset you were about losing your daughter, and I realized that you weren't. You're the woman I always wanted to have by my side," Alex admitted. Margaret stopped breathing for a second, then took a deep breath, hesitating to look at Alex. "I haven't had a wife or even a relationship longer than a couple months. After Vivi, she took away any faith I had in women and people. But you've been able to restore my faith. Your jokes, your concern for the kids, your love for your work. It all made me see that there is good in this world." "Why do you say that?" Margaret asked. "You and I are adults. I think it only takes a couple of days at our realized age to know if someone is your person or not." Margaret finally shifted her gaze to the man. He was looking straight at her. His eyes shone with hope and some feeling she didn't recognize. "You are a very good man. Really 100 times better than my ex-husband or any man I've ever had in my life. But I'm in my 40s. I have 3 kids, a lot of problems, and a mean sister. Do you really need that?" The man grinned and pulled Margaret to him. "I'm not 15 either, Margaret, and I know what I need." A tiny flame of hope flickered in the woman's heart. She smiled timidly. Margaret was walking home from camp late at night. Everything had to be prepared before the inspection. It was almost dark outside, and she was enjoying the cool night air and moonlight. Then she saw someone walking towards her. Margaret smiled. A man was walking towards her with a small bouquet of flowers in his hands. Margaret smiled, embarrassed. "Are these for me?" "It's for the most beautiful woman in this village," Alex tilted his head and said. Margaret laughed. "Yes, clever. Very clever. Thank you." Alex smiled back and put up his elbow. Margaret put her hand on it. "Shall we go for a walk? Only if it's to the house. I don't have the energy at all." Here's how I can edit the continuation of the text. "Can you believe we've cleaned everything we can?" Margaret said. "I don't think a cleaning lady cleans that much in a year. We also put on everything we can in the compound before the inspection. One time they made us clean with a jump rope. Can you believe that?" Margaret laughed. "And we took a test before camp that had a question about how to sanitize baby nipples. And camps from the age of 7? How stupid is that?" Alex shrugged. The phone rang. Margaret pulled the phone out of her pocket and gasped. "It's Kira," the woman whispered, and took a step backward out of weakness. Alex picked her up, afraid she would fall. With a trembling hand, Margaret pressed answer. "Hello, Kira." "Yes, me. Who are you? Where's my daughter? What? How long?" "Let me talk to her. Please, Kira." Margaret put the phone down and looked at Alex in confusion. Her eyes were filled with fear, pain, and confusion. "She's been kidnapped," Margaret said quietly. "They told me to pay $1.5 million in cash. They said they'd send me an address. We have to go to the police." Gathering, Alex said. Margaret shook her head, and the sobs came out again. "They said that if I go to the police, they wouldn't spare her." Alex sighed, taking the woman under his arms and leading her home. After packing their things, they went to the city. By morning, they were already at Margaret's house. She opened the door with her key. She was greeted by Vincent and Matthew. The boys were hugging their mother and looked worried. "Mom, we can't reach Linky. It's been 2 days for Andrew, too," they said. "What are you all so excited about?" shouted a cheerful voice from the kitchen. A woman in a red leather jacket came out into the corridor. The girl wanted to go for a walk. "And you're already shouting. She won't have to live her life with that face." Margaret stared at her sister and threw herself at her. She caught hold of her dark hair and pulled. "It was you, it was all you. You're the reason she stopped talking to me. You're the reason she was taken away. It's all you," Margaret screamed. The sons and Alex barely pulled Margaret away from Vera. Alex wrapped his arms around the woman, pressed her against him, and began to whisper soothing words in her ear. Margaret began to calm down. "You're crazy," Vera shrieked, standing up. Vincent and Matthew looked at each other. "Mom, are you saying she's been kidnapped?" they asked. "She already said that," Alex said a little harshly. "We got a call for ransom." "What makes you think it's my fault?" Vera asked. "Because there's no one else," Alex said again. "You're the only one here who has gotten involved with dangerous people." Vera tilted her head and looked into the man's face. "Alex, what are you doing here?" Alex clenched his jaw, remaining silent. "Guys, get her out of here. Otherwise, I can't vouch for myself," he said. Matthew nodded at the door. Faith opened her eyes wide. The boy took her gently under his arm and led her to the door. "Go to your brother's, Vera. You'll be better off there. No one needs you here. We only put up with you because of Linda." Vera adjusted her bag on her shoulder, hummed, her chin high, and walked quickly away. She was out of sight. A few minutes later, Vincent, Matthew, Alex, and Margaret were sitting at the table in the kitchen. Vincent was making tea while the others talked quietly. There was a cell phone in the middle of the table. Suddenly it rang. Margaret grabbed it and pressed the answer button. "Yes, the money. We don't have the whole amount. Give us time," she said. "Okay, we'll find it all. Is Linda alive? Let me talk to her." "Daughter, are you all right?" Margaret fell silent. Dropped Vincent concluded and put the tea on the table. "Mother, calm down. Did you hear Linda's voice?" Matthew asked. Margaret nodded. She was so frightened. "I can't. Where can we get so much money? Can we sell the cars?" Matthew shrugged his shoulders. "No," Alex said sharply. "I've already called my friends from the army. We'll do everything." The woman jumped up from her seat and grabbed Alex's hands. "No, you're not a robber. She's my daughter, but she's your daughter too," the man objected. "You raised her for years, didn't you?" "Don't you dare," Margaret shouted. "We'll find the money, we'll pay the ransom. Sell the cars," she ordered her sons. The boys nodded. "Is the whole sum here?" Margaret asked, wrapping her trembling hands around the bundle. She was breathing hard and looking around. Matthew nodded. "Mother, make it look easy, please. I'm carrying money to ransom my daughter. Do you really think I can be calm? I can't be calm on principle." The guy shook his head. "Good luck to you." Margaret nodded and walked forward. She had to save her daughter, even if she had to give up all the money to do so. Kira's life was the most important thing. The criminals called and told her to bring the money to the safe deposit box at the airport. Where to pick up Kira, they would tell her later. Margaret walked uncertainly through the airport trying to find the safe deposit boxes. She walked to the right one and slowly opened it, putting the money inside. She slammed the metal door shut and headed away without looking around. The phone vibrated and Margaret jumped in surprise. It was a text message with an address a few blocks from the airport. The woman rushed to the car where her son was waiting for her in Alex's car. "Matthew, let's go. I'll show you the way," she said. The boys started the car and they started. In just a few minutes they were there at the old abandoned factory. Margaret jumped out of the car and rushed inside. Matthew hurried after her. They searched every floor and even the basement, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Margaret screamed until she was hoarse, but there was no answer. The woman turned to her son and began to slowly slide down the cold wall. "Kira is gone. We've lost her, Matthew. We've lost our little girl." "Matthew, what am I going to do?" she moaned. The boy looked around confused. He shouted again and then picked up the mother and walked her to the car. While they were looking for the girl, the sun had set and it had gotten completely dark. Matthew dialed Alex's number. "Uncle Alex, it's empty," he said. "What about you?" Alex asked. "That we're on our way." They found her. Matthew smiled. About 20 minutes later, the car with Matthew and Margaret pulled up to a cottage village. There were several police cars parked near one of the houses. The blinkers were on and there were uniformed men everywhere. Vincent, surrounded by several large men, stood beside one policeman and said something. In the ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, sat Kira. Margaret saw her and rushed over to her. She tripped and fell on the cold grass. Matthew helped his mother up and they ran to the girl. "Kira." Margaret grabbed her daughter's face. "Are you all right? My good girl. Who was that?" Kira saw her mother and started to cry, wrapping her arms around her. "Mommy, they were alone in the apartment and they grabbed me." "Who let them in?" Margaret screamed hysterically. She's Vivi. She let them in. She owes them a lot of money. I became the bait to get you to pay and repay her debts." Margaret ahed and staggered back, grabbing her son's arm. "Are you sure of that?" "She told me herself." Kira nodded. Matthew, hearing his sister's words, rushed to call Alex. "She's gone, neither at home nor at Kira's. I will personally find her and tear her to shreds." He gritted his teeth. Kira nodded and hugged her mother. Vincent walked over to Margaret and took her aside. She needed rest. You know about Vivi? The woman nodded. Her accomplices told me. She sold them her daughter. I can't believe it. How cruel and insane do you have to be? She's always been like that, Margaret exhaled. Do you know how she found Kira? She snuck into your house to find your residential address and followed it. Kira was just at the guy's place. Margaret shook her head in surprise. You were right. She's a terrible woman. A year later, a high fence stood outside a small house with a new red roof. A variety of flowers grew in the garden. A woman in a green dress jumped out of the house. I have to go, Vincent. It's your first day as a geography teacher, Stacy smiled. You have 40 minutes before school starts. Vincent caught up with the woman and pulled her close. You're too early, and I still have half an hour before work. Stacy laughed and waved her husband away. Look, I have to go, but I'll be home early. We have to go to Emily's tonight. We're going to be grandparents soon, aren't we? Vincent frowned. You're not a grandmother, you're the most beautiful girl. I haven't been a girl for too long, and you're going to have to accept that. Stacy laughed. You're going to be the youngest and most beautiful grandmother in the world. The phone rang. Mom, Lindsay had a baby. Alex yelled into the phone. I'm an uncle now, and Emily is an aunt. We're all uncles and aunts now. Matthew's joyful voice rang out. Girl 3200 added Angela, Matthew's girlfriend. Stacy disconnected the phone and smiled happily. Vincent picked her up and spun her around the yard. Maybe we should be parents again, he asked. Stacy laughed. We should be grandparents for now, and then we'll see from there. Anyway, we're going to Prague in August and then Venice. You remember, don't you? It's my dream, and now nothing will stop me from fulfilling it. It really was. Nothing and no one could stop Stacy from fulfilling her dream. The children learned to live on their own, accepting that a mother should have her own life. Vincent finally moved in with Stacy, beginning to set up house. Vivi was caught by the police in a neighboring town. Stacy went to see her only once. Vivi had begged her to take a statement, but her sister, who had gotten her out of trouble all her life, had said no for the first time. Only now did Stacy realize that in saving her sister from punishment as a child and young adult, she had only made things worse. Vivi was used to being selfish, expecting to always be helped. Now she's going to prison for selling her niece Kira, who will never remember her birth mother again. For she has realized that her real mother is Stacy. A rich man sheltered a shivering beggar, and when at night he heard the melody of a lullaby. Daddy, I got first place, said Mealy. Andrew smiled. It was his daughter. For 15 years of her life, she had given her father many reasons to be proud of herself. And now the girl called her parent to inform about another victory. She was in New York on another Olympiad for young programmers. Mealy went there as part of a group from the Center for Gifted Children, where she had been studying for 4 years. My smart girl, congratulations, said the man. I owe you a present. I'm so glad. Mealy's voice trembled with excitement. This contest was very important to her. It had been about 5 years since Mealy had decided on her profession. She would be a programmer and would definitely go to Stanford to study. There are so many opportunities for young professionals there, not like in their provincial town. Mealy was already getting crowded. But to get into such a prestigious university, you need to win national and international competitions. So Mealy was doing her best. Rest now, encouraged his daughter Andrew. Walk around New York, since you are in such a beautiful city. But be careful there. Yes, Daddy, of course, I love you. Mealy pressed the reset button. A short beep sounded in the phone. Andrew smiled again. Mealy is so smart, intelligent, sensible, far more savvy than he is. At her age, her daughter will achieve a lot. Oh my. And some 9 or 10 years ago, Andrew was looking for information about schools for children with mental retardation. Everything was going to give her to the first grade of the correctional institution, in a normal school, and certainly in the gymnasium or lyceum would not take her, because in his 6 years the girl did not speak a word, mooing. Sometimes she explained something with gestures if she needed something urgently, but this rarely happened. Most often the daughter was in her own thoughts, sitting on the windowsill in the nursery. It was her favorite place, looking out the window and thinking about something. Mealy hardly smiled at that time. Andrew did not immediately notice that something was wrong with his daughter. He was too busy with his own grief. And Mealy? Well, what could Mealy understand then? She was only 2 years old. She probably didn't even remember Leanie, her mother. That's what Andrew thought. But the disappearance of her mother from the life of a 2-year-old baby still caused a serious trauma to the little girl. It turned out later. The consequences were catastrophic. Every time Mealy achieved another success, Andrew rejoiced and saddened at the same time. Rejoiced. It is understandable why. Sadness, on the other hand, was due to Leanie not seeing it all. She would have been happy to know that her favorite, long-awaited daughter was growing up to be such a smart girl. But that's just the way it turned out. Andrew grew up in a wealthy family and was an only child. Moreover, even at the grandparents, he turned out to be the only grandchild. It is not difficult to assume that from an early age Andrew bathed in love, recognition, and attention of loved ones. He had everything he needed for happiness: beautiful clothes, expensive toys. He was taken to expensive resorts. Delicious pancakes and fragrant pies were prepared for him on demand. Andrew received detailed answers to all his questions and at any time could play with one of his relatives, for example, in board or mobile games. He was never refused. His relatives adored Andrew, and he reciprocated them. It is a blessing to have such a strong, friendly family, where everyone is ready to support the other in any situation. When Andrew became older, he had to study a lot in a prestigious private school. A lot of lessons were assigned, and additionally the boy was engaged in several sections: swimming, boxing, financial literacy, business school, all because he was to become the heir to the family business. So parents called the network of pizzerias, the owners of which were. Business steadily brought good profits and grew, developed. Even branches in other cities opened. Andrew, since childhood, delved into the wisdom of family business. His father often took him with him to the office, showed his very young son financial documents. In general, his father was actively preparing his replacement. "There's not much that can happen to me. You must be ready at any moment to be at the helm," he said. However, immediately added, "But I hope, of course, for a long time to remain a leader. And in any case, I need a worthy assistant. Very soon you will become my right hand." Andrew didn't mind. He liked his father's business, liked to get into the nuances of his business. And the young guy sometimes had quite worthwhile ideas, which his father praised very much and put into practice. Andrew was a great pleasure to see the eyes of his parents light up with pride for his only son. Then Andrew went to study in Moscow, entered the economics department of a prestigious university. Not entirely independently, his father connected some of his connections, but Andrew studied completely independently and was one of the best students of the course. Metropolitan life fascinated the guy. It was bright, rich, diverse, full of adventures and new acquaintances. But Moscow was also tiring as a metropolis. It's good to come here to have fun, to get new impressions. But it's also great to study here, of course. Where else to find such a cluster of talented teachers, theoreticians, and practitioners who have achieved dizzying success? Thought Andrew. But by the last course he realized that his destiny life in his native small town. In Yumatov, quiet, calm, cozy. There is no such a rush there. The road to the office takes a maximum of 20 minutes, and that's if you get into a traffic jam. And in general, there is a special atmosphere in my hometown. It gives me strength and confidence. In general, Andrew himself decided to return to Yumatov. All the more his father needed a right hand. But he knew that if he wanted to stay in Moscow, his parents would not have pressured and did not oppose. They would have supported their son in any case. And it's just wonderful to have such a reliable rear behind him. Andrew came to Yumatov and got to work. Together with his father, they thought over a new project: the opening of a Japanese restaurant. This business was to become a new step in the development of the family business. Prospects were pleasing, plans were inspiring. It seemed that a cloudless future was ahead. In the end, everything with the restaurant of Japanese cuisine turned out, but not immediately, but after almost 5 years. For a while, the project had to be forgotten, as important events began to happen one after another in Andrei's life. And then later, this restaurant practically saved a man's life, distracted him, shifted his attention, and helped him get away from destructive thoughts. But that was later. Anyway, one fine December day, Andrei decided that it was time for him to unwind. He called his former classmate Alexei, and the friends went to the skating rink, just like in the good old days. The skating rink was large, located on the central square of the city. The music was playing loudly, and people of all ages and builds were sliding smoothly on the ice. Snow was falling from the sky in large flakes. In the center of the rink stood a 3-meter-tall Christmas tree. Soon New Year's Eve, Andrei's favorite holiday since childhood. Until now, his parents made him a sweet gift, collected in a beautiful package with Santa Claus' favorite candies of their already 25-year-old son. Andrei was sincerely pleased with this surprise every time. He felt so warm at heart, and memories of his happy childhood came back to his mind at once. Andrei was confident on skates. In childhood, he and Alexei managed to go to the hockey section for 2 years. Then both of them had no time for sports. They started serious studies, but their skills haven't gone anywhere. Here he is, Alexei already at the other end of the rink with girls trying to get acquainted. Andrei grinned. Yes, his buddy will not miss a single beauty. Such a guy won't be missed anywhere. Andrei looked at his friend and therefore probably did not immediately notice her, a girl in a white down jacket and light jeans, so fragile, almost transparent. And he, a big guy, ran at her and of course knocked her down. Ouch. The young people exclaimed at the same time. Andrei suddenly felt his cheeks flooding with pain. He had pushed a man. The guy hastily gave the stranger his hand, helping her up. "Sorry, please, it's my fault." "Are you hurt?" he babbled, looking into her marvelous blue eyes. "No, I'm all right." The girl waved her hand. "I was looking around and didn't notice you driving." Andrew could not believe his ears. She apologized. Miracles and only. It would be more logical to hear outraged exclamations from the girl. "I'm sorry, I've only recently gotten on skates. Anyway, I don't know how to skate. That's why I'm bumping into everyone." "But instead," Evie said, "I'm the one who hit you." Andrew looked into the girl's wide-open blue eyes and realized that he did not want to let go of her hand. Although the interlocutor has long stood firmly on her feet, and in his help obviously no longer needed, long brown strands of hair stood out from under her white down jacket. The girl's cheeks were bright pink from the frost. She looked so beautiful, so young, so touching, that the boy couldn't take his eyes off her. "Maybe if you don't mind, I could give you a lesson. Teach you how to skate." "You'd better stay on the ice," Andrew suggested. "That would be great. I never dreamed of having a personal trainer. But that's exactly what I need today," Evie smiled. That's how Andrew met his future wife. Only then, of course, he did not know about it yet. He didn't even think about it, just enjoyed talking to a beautiful girl. Looking like snow maidens in their white jackets, they took a long ride. Matthew had long since left the rink. Andrew and Evie still didn't want to part. They talked about all sorts of things that day, as if they had known each other for 100 years. Andrew was surprised at how much they coincided in everything. Of course, the young people exchanged phone numbers and started dating. Andrew knew about his father's plans for his personal life. The parent wanted his son to marry Mealy, the daughter of a local entrepreneur and business partner. Then the financial gatekeepers would merge their empires into something grand. Mealy was quite a nice girl. The same age as Andrew, serious, career-oriented. She was also preparing to become her father's right-hand woman. Andrew was even initially not against becoming her spouse. Why not? A worthy option. But meeting Evie put an end to all those plans. Evie was from a middle class or even poor family. It was a fine line. Evie lived with her parents and 2 younger brothers in a 2-room apartment. They didn't starve. They didn't wear rags. Evie had even graduated from the local university. But the family couldn't afford much. For example, they never traveled or dined in restaurants. That is, the financial levels of Evie and Andrew were very different. The girl was a little embarrassed by this, but the guy didn't care. He dreamed of showing Evie the whole world, to make her life bright, happy, and carefree. Andrew truly fell in love and felt that it was mutual. The guy realized that his parents would not be thrilled with this choice. At first, they warned him so many times about girls who dreamed of hooking a boy from a wealthy family, mercantile ladies who planned to move into a beautiful life on the hump of a man in love with them. Andrew knew that such really existed, even met him more than once. But the intentions of such pirate girls were obvious, no matter how much they tried to hide it. And Evie? She was different. Andrew was sure that his mother and father, having gotten to know Evie better, would understand everything and accept his son's choice. And even if not, Andrew was almost indifferent to the opinion of his parents, just to be near his beloved, to see her deep blue eyes, hear her gentle voice and feel how she puts her head on his shoulder. This gesture, for some reason, was particularly endearing to the guy. And so it came to pass. Evie was very afraid to meet Andrew's parents, but it was impossible to postpone. The guy proposed to his beloved, she agreed. No matter how it went, she'd have to meet her new in-laws. The acquaintance went just fine. As Andrew expected, the charming bride won the hearts of his mother and father. It could not be otherwise. Andrew, of course, met with the parents of his future wife and was surprised to note that Evie's father clearly abused alcohol. It was noticeable in his eyes, skin color, trembling hands. The girl's mother looked pale and exhausted. Apparently, she had to carry her entire family on her own. Andrew then sincerely felt sorry for her. Kira did not tell Andrew about his father before, apparently embarrassed. But did she think that his attitude to her because of this will change? How could Kira assume such a thing? In general, having seen in what conditions live his beloved, Andrew even stronger strengthened in the decision to quickly take her away from there, in a new life. Then there was a wedding, lavish, loud, cheerful. Kira, in her wedding dress, resembled a fairy tale princess. Andrew could not take his eyes off her, and he was not the only one. The bride received many compliments from all the guests. True, Kira did not know how to accept them at all. Very embarrassed, although she was pleased. Andrew and Kira began to live in the apartment of her husband. The guy has long since settled in his own home, to his parents came only to visit. Those were wonderful days. Kira was getting used to a new home, to a new life. The newlyweds were learning how to live together. Adult relatives warned that the process of lapping usually does not go as smoothly as we would like. Inevitable conflicts, disputes, quarrels. But in the case of Kira and Andrew, nothing of the kind happened. Young spouses as if they were created for each other. Andrew every day mentally thanked fate for the fact that she brought him together with Kira. He could not believe that they are so coincidental. They like the same movies and books, the same look at things, even phrases for each other sometimes finish. Kira worked as a notary's assistant in a local office, and Andrew developed a business with his father. Love, mutual understanding, a house full of cups. It seemed that only cloudless happiness awaited the newlyweds ahead. And so it was for some time, about a year after the wedding. Kira informed her husband that she was expecting a child. The joy of the future father had no limit. They had already been planning a baby for 6 months, but it did not work out in any way. The newlyweds were going to the doctors, waiting for Kira's vacation, tuning in for a long, systematic search for the problem. And here it is, happiness. Everything worked out by itself. Pregnancy was not very easy. Kira was constantly nauseated. She went to the hospital every now and then. Closer to the birth, Kira was diagnosed with heart problems. It seemed as if they had not been there before, or they did not manifest themselves. And then the body, coping with the increased load, suddenly gave failure. Andrew's parents found the best doctors for Kira. She was constantly under observation. Andrew was painful to see his beloved in such a state, and from fear for her, he anxiously clenched his heart. Fortunately, everything went safely. In due time, Kira gave birth to a healthy, strong girl. At the family council, it was decided to name the baby girl Evie. Andrew was happy everything was fine with the child. Kira was also on the mend after childbirth, and the recovery of the young mother's body was in full swing, as evidenced by numerous examinations. Kira quickly recovered and happily plunged into taking care of her daughter. Andrew also did not stay aside, tried to fully enjoy the infancy of his long-awaited child. The man realized that the second baby in their family will not be. Doctors made it clear that Kira contraindicated pregnancy and childbirth. She barely survived this time, too. According to the cardiologist, the young woman was just lucky. Andrew was not ready to risk the most expensive thing he has in his life. And one child is enough for them. He is also in the family alone. Evie turned out to be exactly as it should: healthy, smart, cheerful, agile, and quick. As soon as the daughter began to walk, immediately learned to climb into the most unexpected places, then in the closet with clothes her parents found her, or in the toy box. You need to keep an eye on such a prankster. Evie immediately became a favorite of numerous relatives, parents, grandparents. Adults did not want to soul in the girl, often visited her, gave gifts. Andrew's mother was especially pleased with her granddaughter. Finally, there is for whom to buy dresses. And that all these shorts and sneakers are boring already. Sooner the girl's hair would grow back. I want to braid her pigtails. A year and a half passed. Evie was already starting to talk. Kira devoted all her time to her daughter, singing her songs, telling her poems, practicing finger games and gymnastics with the little girl. And the results were evident. The girl in her year and a half quite clearly spoke in sentences, of course, with a childish accent, but adults understood her perfectly. Andrew's heart clenched with tenderness when his little girl addressed him. The word, this miraculously fragile creature with a height of just over 80 centimeters, made him stronger. The man felt that for the sake of his daughter and wife, he could roll mountains. They were so happy. But at least it seemed so to Andrew. However, Kira once very surprised him, saying that she is happy, of course, but still not quite. It turned out that Kira had dreamed of having another child. Evie has grown up, and looking at the little girl, I regret that the girl will have to grow up alone. You see, I have 2 brothers after all. It's so great. We were never bored. We ran everywhere together, played, talked a lot about everything, stood for each other. But the girl is all alone. That's not good. But I too grew up alone in the family, Andrew objected with a smile. And I had quite a happy childhood. You just don't know what you were deprived of. Kira shook her head and sighed sadly. Andrew felt uneasy. He didn't like this talk. You know it's dangerous for you to give birth again. Remember how hard Evie was on us. You were on the brink so many times. But we didn't know then, and now we do, and we realize it's very dangerous. We've had enough of Evie. That's exactly what we know, Kira exclaimed. And that's why we're going to make a bed. I'll see a cardiologist, I'll take all the right medications. And I'll prepare for pregnancy. I'm already taking the right vitamins. I've read a lot about these cases. If you keep everything under control, the risk is minimal. Kira dreamed of having another child. But Andrew was adamant. They even had their first fight over it. His wife convinced him that everything will be fine. You just need to follow the prescriptions of doctors, constantly observed by specialists, and she is ready for this for the sake of the second baby. However, the man could not risk Kira's life. Of course, he wanted a big family, several children, but not at such a cost. To test fate again, given their recent experience, was foolish. And yet it happened. On a sunny July morning, Kira informed Andrew that they would have a second baby boy. The man was truly terrified then. He probably even turned pale. What's wrong with you? Everything will be fine. You'll see. Kira laughed and put her hand on his shoulder. Andrew only shook his head. He knew. Felt that nothing was going to be okay anymore. The pregnancy, oddly enough, was going much easier than the first time. Kira was feeling good, taking lots of walks. She followed all the doctor's recommendations and was examined very often. She literally never left the hospital, although her condition was quite bearable. Everything seemed to be in order, but on the soul of Andrew was uneasy. And for good reason. It happened at night. Suddenly nothing foretold trouble. Andrew woke up from the quiet sounds. Kira was sick, so bad that she couldn't even call for help. Kira was suffocating. Andrew jumped up, turned on the light, and was horrified. He had never seen his wife in such a state. So pale. Black circles under her eyes like a dead man's white skin. Kira's dried lips glistened with sweat. Her chest heaved. The woman was short of breath. Andrew grabbed the phone in a panic and called an ambulance. Then he called his mother to have her and his father come over and sit with Evie. The baby was sleeping sweetly in her princess room and didn't even realize something scary was going on. Andrew held Kira's cold hand, confessed his love to her, asked her to hold on, and prayed. For the first time in his life, he probably prayed to himself that the doctors would make it in time. It seemed to him that when help arrived, it would be too late. And from this thought, Andrew began to panic. But the doctors were in time. Several uniformed men arrived. They went into the bedroom. Kira took a cardiogram, measured her blood pressure. She was listened to, then injected with something, the woman seemed to feel better. At least she was breathing more freely. Andrew exhaled. Everything would be all right now. His parents came over to babysit Evie, so Andrew calmly followed the ambulance to keep an eye on Kira. The man drove through the night city behind the car, in which at the same time medics were fighting for the life of his wife. They should be able to handle it. They're professionals. It's going to be okay. That's what Andrew convinced himself as he drove along. But reaching the hospital, the man learned the terrible news. Kira was not brought. She was gone right in the ambulance. The doctors did everything they could. Pregnancy, which Andrew was so afraid of, still finished his wife. The child could not be saved either. For a while, the man went into himself. He was not interested in anything, neither business, nor his own health, not even a small daughter. He blamed himself for not changing Kira's mind, not forcing her to have an abortion. Of course, he was to blame for everything that had happened. He should have been a more attentive and sensitive husband. He failed, did not save his happiness. Life without Kira made no sense. They had so many plans, so many joint desires. And now what? Andrew felt sorry for himself. Who else will understand him so much as a spouse? Who will love him so much? But even more, the man was sorry for so suddenly, early cut short the young life of his wife. She had not seen all those corners of the planet, which Andrew promised to show her. Didn't have time to enjoy life properly. Mother and father tried to pull their son out of the abyss of despair. They brought to him psychotherapists and psychologists who conducted soul-saving conversations with the man. Sometimes it did make things easier, but only for a while. Andrew did not understand why he should live on. The worst thing was that he didn't even want to see Evie. The girl misses you, his mother tried to get through to her son. Not only did her mom die, but her father disappeared from her life. Just imagine what it's like for the child. Andrew didn't want to imagine anything. He didn't care. And anyway, what can a little girl who is not even 2 years old understand? Probably has already forgotten in Kira and me. But her mother insisted that Evie was not well. She doesn't talk to anyone else or smile. Remember how giggly our little girl used to be? Now she sits around all day rearranging cubes. It's a terrible sight. No one can get her to move. What if you can do it? Only 6 months after the tragedy, Andrea began to slowly come back to life. Parents, friends, and doctors helped. And of course Evie too. The man started working again. And then just then his father offered him to develop a long-planned project, a restaurant of Japanese cuisine. Andrew gladly seized the opportunity to distract himself for a while. The project is huge, a lot of work. We'll have to work hard to enter the market. That's good. Let his head be filled with familiar things rather than destructive thoughts. That's when the man came to see his daughter for the first time in a long time. Andrew felt guilty in front of the little girl. It was as if he betrayed her, abandoned her, left her to her parents. After all, the mother is right, Evie has experienced a huge tragedy. And even if she does not realize everything as an adult, but at the level of feelings certainly felt it to the full. Kira and Evie were so close. She followed her mother like a tail, even climbing into her crib. At night, she'd lie at her mother's side. They were never apart for more than a couple hours. And then all of a sudden, Andrew hardly recognized his daughter. Of course, he realized that children grow up fast at that age. When the tragedy happened, Evie was barely 2 years old. How hard it is for Andrew to survive such a tragedy, to lose his beloved wife Kira, and to see the state of his little daughter Evie after this grief. And after 6 months, he finally decided to visit his daughter. And she was already 2.5 years old. The look of her blue eyes, so similar to Kira's eyes, was sad and somehow adult, not childishly serious. Evie had really grown quiet and sad. She didn't run, she didn't laugh, she didn't even smile. She used to be such a talkative little girl, a real giggler. Relatives and friends were surprised at how developed she was for her age. And now the girl said nothing at all, only sometimes mooed something under her nose. This discovery alarmed Andre. The mother explained that it was the consequences of stress, that all the doctors examined Evie. Physically, she is healthy. But the doctors don't really believe that she used to talk so well for her years. They say it'll work out, she'll talk again. Many children her age are still silent. Andre was grateful to his parents for taking care of his child. He himself was in no condition to take care of the baby after losing Kira. Eva is very cute. For us it is even enjoy, they said. Andrew went with his head into work on a new restaurant of Japanese cuisine, Yamato. He put all his efforts into the project, trying to achieve the highest quality. The restaurant opened even ahead of schedule, but Andre wanted more. He dreamed of having guests from all over the city, and even the region. With Evie he now saw, but not often. The girl still lived with her grandparents. Andrew plunged into work with his head, trying to distract himself from the heartache. Andrew's mother did a lot with her granddaughter Evie and took her to specialists. She developed the little girl at home as best she could. But there was no result. Evie grew up, but she never spoke. It was painful for Andrew to see his once cheerful little girl in such a state. It seemed she still hadn't recovered from what had happened with Kira. Andrew, of course, was still worried too. He longed for Kira, blamed himself periodically, and despaired over his inability to hug his loved one. But he was older and stronger. Besides, he had a job in Evie. She could not cope with her misfortune, and the specialists, on which her adult relatives were not stingy, were powerless. Andrew, on the advice of doctors, bought a cozy country house with a large yard. On the territory arranged for Evie a whole fairy tale park with fountains, swings, and even her own little castle, and in the backyard for the baby built a pool. Many doctors said that swimming has a beneficial effect on the nervous system of children, so Andrew took it upon himself to teach his daughter to swim. Evie quickly figured out what to do. Now she did not get out of the pool in the summer days and again from side to side like a fish. But that didn't work either. True, she became more athletic and sturdy, which of course is not bad either. But she was still silent and not particularly eager to interact with the world around her. Andrew was now taking care of his daughter on his own. That was his decision. After all, a daughter was his fatherly responsibility and duty. During the day with Evie sat Nanny, because the little girl could not be given to a regular kindergarten, and in the correctional did not want there are children with serious diagnoses and mental retardation. Evie is not like that. She is very smart. She has lively, intelligent eyes. She just doesn't speak yet. But daycare is voluntary. You can take your child if you want, or you can keep her at home. And Evie's 6 years old. School's just around the corner. If it goes on like this, we'll have to send the little girl to a special school for children with special developmental needs. Andrew dreaded the thought of sending Evie to a special school. He knew his daughter was capable of many things. She sees everything, notices and understands everything. But she is silent. She can't go to a remedial school. It would only make things worse. But the doctors made it clear that there was no other way out. If a year of rehabilitation does not yield results, Evie will be enrolled in a special school, because she must be educated anyway. Evie, will you say a word? Andrew begged his daughter. You can, can't you? I know. The girl looked at her father with indifferent eyes and remained silent. And then went to his room, sat on his favorite wide windowsill, hugged his knees with his hands and thought about something known only to her. She could sit like that for hours. That November evening, Andrew stayed late at the office. He warned Evie's nanny and promised to reward her generously for her overtime hours. She didn't mind. I've had a lot of children, the nanny shook her head. But this is the first time I've met such a quiet and unproblematic. It's a pleasure to sit with the girl. You can't see her. You can't hear her. Andrew, of course, was not pleased with such compliments to his daughter. It would be better if Evie, like other children, asked a million questions a minute and methodically trashed the whole house. But no. Sitting on the windowsill, staring off into the distance. If you call her to dinner, she comes, eats, cleans up the dishes. If you don't call her, she won't remember that it's time to eat. And so it is in everything. No initiative, no desires. Except for the pool in the summer months gave the girl some pleasure. And even there, in the warm water, she did not smile. So Andrew left the office late. It was almost 8 o'clock. On the way, the man remembered that Evie's favorite cereal had run out at home. It would be a pity if she didn't get the usual product for breakfast. No, the little girl wouldn't make a scandal, wouldn't get cranky, and certainly wouldn't get hysterical. Evie probably wouldn't give away her disappointment. In that sense, Evie was indeed a trouble-free child. But Andrew wanted to please his daughter, at least in small things. He carefully noticed what Evie liked, and tried to bring her positive emotions more often. Andrew parked near a convenience store and got out of the warm interior of the car. It was slushy, dark, and uncomfortable outside on a cold November evening. His face was immediately blasted by the icy wind. The man lifted the collar of his jacket to protect his neck and cheeks from the merciless gusts and walked briskly toward the supermarket doors. The doors obediently slid to the sides, letting the visitor inside. Andrew found himself on the stairs leading upward. It was much warmer here than outside, but the dim bulb under the ceiling gave little light. The entire floor was covered in dirt that the cleaning lady hadn't had time to clean up yet, not a very cozy or pleasant place. The man was about to go up to the store when he noticed a girl in a thin coat that was soaked through. She was sitting behind a column on a high curb that stretched along the wall. Andrew stopped. There was something about the girl's appearance that the man immediately realized she was in trouble and needed help. Long blonde hair, disheveled by the wind, thin hands shivering in the deep pockets of her coat, and her eyes huge eyes of a marvelous turquoise hue. Andrew, it seems, had never seen such confused and sad eyes. It was necessary to approach this stranger, to find out what happened, but Andrew did not want to frighten her. After all, he is a man, and she is a fragile young girl, probably anxious and thinking about him unknowingly. So he walked on by. The supermarket was already sparsely populated. Andrew walked slowly through the rows, throwing Evie's favorite cereal, sausage, cheese, some fruit for himself into his basket. Then he saw a beautiful doll that looked a lot like Evie. Andrew smiled and put the pink box with the rest of his purchases. Maybe this toy would make his silent princess happy just a little. All the while he wondered if that girl would still be there when he left the store. The man hoped that the girl would leave, because otherwise he would have to offer her help. Otherwise his conscience would torment him later. Who knows what her story is? I would not want to get involved in anything. But Andrew's hopes were not realized. The girl sat in the same place, wrapping her arms around her shoulders, trying to stop shivering. Apparently she was frozen to the bone in her thin, soaked coat after the recent downpour with hail. Andrew approached her resolutely and, trying to soften her tone as much as possible, asked, "Are you all right?" The girl raised her amazing eyes at him, in which clearly read surprise. But she smiled a very beautiful, sincere, and kind smile. "Yes, of course it's all right." "I think you're not telling the truth," Andrew also smiled and replied. "You see, when people are fine, they don't sit alone in the supermarket, shivering from the cold. Maybe you should call a cab. You obviously need to get home, get warm." "No, I don't have a home. I don't have a home," she admitted with her head down. "How?" Andrew was surprised. She didn't look homeless in any way. She looked well-groomed and not badly dressed. "It's a long story. But everything will be fine with me. I'll think of something now," she assured. After such an admission, Andrew couldn't just walk away. He sat down next to her on the curb and looked into her eyes. "Tell me, I have a lot of time, so I would love to hear your very long story." Andrew felt sorry for this young girl. What if someday his Evie would find herself in a difficult situation? She will need help, and people will pass by indifferently. After all, this girl is someone's daughter, too. Here's what a stranger who identified herself as Stacy told me. "I grew up in a village in a large family. When I was 10 years old, my father died on a construction site, and our family fell on hard times. The head of the family used to provide for us. By village standards, we lived very well, a full cup, our own household. My mother didn't work. She took care of the house and the children. There were 5 of us. I was the eldest. A vegetable garden, chickens, 2 cows, a goat, there was enough to do. And then Mom was left alone with us. At first, it seemed that the family would manage to stay afloat. But soon it became clear nothing would work. There was a catastrophic lack of money. We had to sell livestock, but the proceeds were not enough for long. Mom tried to work, but for some reason she didn't stay anywhere for long. And in the village there was not enough suitable vacancies. And so my mother started to take to the bottle. Apparently, when she got drunk, she forgot about the loss of her loved one, moneylessness, lack of work, and need. We children were left to our own devices. The house was always dirty and uncomfortable now. I, as the eldest, tried to keep order and bring up my younger brothers and sisters. But I was just a child myself. Looking at what was happening, I firmly decided that I didn't want to live like that. I will definitely have a different fate. While my brothers and sisters rejoiced in the freedom that no one controls, does not force to clean or do homework, I studied. I realized that in order to make it in the world, you have to get an education, and for that you have to sweat. I was praised at school, set as an example to my classmates, and there was a reason for that. Everyone knew the conditions in which I lived. And yet I managed to always look clean, tidy, and study only for A's. Toward the end of 9th grade, Stacy decided on her future profession. She decided to become a teacher. The girl was good at getting along with children, especially with little ones. She taught all her younger brothers and sisters to read and write, although they resisted at first. But Stacy managed to find an approach to each one. She also enjoyed watching the children of her neighbors, and not just to make sure that they did not climb anywhere, and taught them useful things: toddlers, colors and shapes, and older letters and numbers. The parents of the children were delighted with the results and paid the clever girl with food and sweets. Everyone said that she would make a wonderful teacher. In fact, the adults encouraged Stacy to think about her future profession. Time flew by, and now Stacy received her high school diploma with only A's. Her teachers helped her apply to teacher training college and helped her get a dormitory. There was no hope for Stacy's mother in this regard. She had lost her way, turning into a likeness of herself. It was obvious to everyone that there was nothing to be done. The younger children had been placed in an orphanage. It was simply too dangerous for them to stay with such a mother. Stacy had at least looked after them, but the girl had to study. She felt sorry for the younger ones, but she realized that they would be better off in the orphanage, where they would at least be fed and sent to school. And what awaited the children at home? Hunger, cold, and dirt. Stacy's life began anew. She took to her studies with gusto, used to studying, learning new things, becoming smarter and more experienced. Soon she became the best student of her course and was held up as an example to her classmates. In the course of her studies, Stacy realized that she liked working with difficult children. It's easy to work with ordinary children, but kids with special needs are more interesting, and the results are very satisfying. That's why Stacy specifically asked for an internship at a remedial school. There she immediately found out that she can find an approach even to the most difficult children. She was in contact with children with very serious diagnoses, to which even experienced specialists could not reach. "You have a gift, no other way," wondered the head of the school. Stacy smiled embarrassedly. She had been modest and shy since she was a child. After graduating from college, Stacy was immediately hired at the very school where she was interning. The salary was small, but it was enough money for food and a tiny apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her own place, albeit modest. By then, Stacy's sisters had graduated from the orphanage. One became a seamstress, the other a pastry chef. Both soon married well, and their husbands were from out of town. Of course, they took their wives with them. Stacy was happy for her sisters, and a little surprised that they were younger than she was. Very young, almost children, but already married ladies. Now she could not worry about them. Their destinies would work out well. True, they will not see each other often. They are separated by thousands of kilometers. But this is not the main thing. The sisters have husbands, education, work. Stacy's two younger brothers were adopted by a couple of Hiddings, bright red-haired twins with blue eyes. The boys came to the orphanage as toddlers, just 8 years old. Handsome, bright, smiling, they were quickly taken in by a family from the city. Stacy didn't know where her brothers were now. Adoption was a secret. But in the orphanage she was told that the new parents very good, wealthy people. So the brothers' fate was safe too. Stacy's mother had a tragic story during her college years. During another drinking party, which her mother regularly organized in her empty house, one of the guests fell asleep with a lit cigarette. The wooden building burst into flames like a torch. Some of the guests managed to escape the burning building, but the mother and several others did not escape. Perhaps they were sound asleep and did not notice anything. It is scary to think what would have happened to the siblings if they had not been in the orphanage. So by her 20s, Stacy was pretty much alone in the world. Her mother was gone. Brothers and sisters moved to different corners of the vast country. Not even her own home was left. But Stacy was not discouraged. She had a desirable profession, a favorite job. It was hard, of course, alone, but she could cope. She had her whole life ahead of her. She'd meet her love, and she'd have children. And their apartment will be big and cozy. Stacy would never repeat her mother's fate. And that's how the young girl lived in a rented apartment. She worked, went to movies and attractions with her friends, educated herself, read a lot of additional literature on the education of special children. And then, perhaps, age took its toll. One day Stacy realized that she couldn't and didn't want to be alone anymore. She needed someone near and dear to her who would take care of her, and she would take care of him too. How great it is to fall asleep and wake up next to a loved one, to talk with him on a variety of topics, to support each other, to make plans for the future. Would Max have made such an impression on Stacy if he had met her at another time? Perhaps the girl fell in love with him so sincerely and wholeheartedly only because she was already ready to fall in love, waiting for it. And then the right person came along. Stacy thought about it later, but she'd never thought about it when she'd met Max. She was on her way back from a friend's birthday party. It was evening. Stacy was in a good mood. They'd had a good time, laughed a lot. The girls went to the club to continue the party. Stacy refused. She didn't like those places. Noisy, crowded, cramped. And she didn't have much money left. She'd just have to make it to her next paycheck. Stacy had 2 important appliances out of order this month, a hairdryer and an electric kettle. Unforeseen expenses. Stacy looked lovely that night, knew it. A flowing, beautiful, slim-fitting sundress, loose hair, light makeup. The proof of the girl's attractiveness was the stares she felt on her. It was pleasant, though a little embarrassing. "Girl, you are so beautiful. Can I meet you?" A voice came from the side. Stacy turned around and met Matthew's eyes. She didn't know it was Matthew at the time, of course. She saw a wonderful guy in front of her. Kind, open face, open eyes of a beautiful hazel hue. There was a lot in them, a light, an interest, and admiration. You could drown in those eyes. "So you don't mind if I walk beside you for a while?" The boy looked at Stacy questioningly. No, the girl smiled. She really wanted this stranger to walk her home. But at the same time, Stacy was embarrassed by her own desire. "Fine," the escort dispelled. They walked through the park. Matthew told his new acquaintance jokes, shared some news, asked her questions about her life. He talked about himself, too. Matthew was an easy and pleasant person to talk to, charming, relaxed. He had a good tongue. The young man didn't go out of his way for a word. Stacy was immediately impressed by the sincerity with which he talked about his own life. And she was sincere with him, too. Matthew's honesty implied a reciprocal honesty. It turned out that Matthew and Stacy had a lot in common. Matthew, too, had grown up in the village, and he, too, was the eldest in a large family. Except that he didn't know his father and didn't remember him. He'd asked his mother, of course, but she didn't seem to remember who had given her her firstborn. Stacy's mother had started drinking after her husband died. Matthew's mother had been drinking for as long as he could remember. But Matthew, despite the lack of control and upbringing, still finished 9 grades, because he understood perfectly well without it he would not achieve anything in life, and dreams and ambitions were always present. So having finished 9 grades, the boy went to the city. The average score of the certificate was not too high, but still the boy was taken to the construction technical college. There was a shortage in one of the faculties. It was just luck. Matthew lived with his grandmother during his studies. She'd never been involved in her grandson's life before. She'd cut her failed daughter out of her life. As if at first tried to pull her out of the swamp, but realizing that it was useless, eliminated. But the eldest grandson did not drive away. She welcomed him warmly. She gave him a separate room and even provided him with money at first, until Matthew found a part-time job. The boy started working early. Life made him do it. While still living with his mother in the village, he mowed grass for someone, helped to paste wallpaper, and painted fences for neighbors. The pay was low, but there was enough for bread and milk. Sometimes there was also enough for sweets. If the boy had not taken care of himself, it is not known whether he would have survived or not. Because there was no hope for his mother, she was not interested in anything but the bottle. In the city, there were much more opportunities for part-time work, especially for a hard-working and not afraid of difficulties student of construction college. So many construction sites, and everywhere you need helpers, ready to do low-skilled work. And the pay was pretty good by Matthew's standards. When I was in college, my younger sisters were taken away to an orphanage. Matthew shook his head sadly. Some of the neighbors complained to the guardianship office, and they did the right thing. The girls would have been lost with their mother. I wanted to file a report myself, but I couldn't make up my mind. I thought maybe it was wrong. Matthew continued. I visited the sisters at the orphanage, bringing them candy and coloring books, asking about their lives. The girls told me that everything was fine, but they still missed their mother, despite her attitude towards them. And then one day I came and found out that the girls had been taken away to a family. I never saw them again. Maybe we'll meet again someday. Life is long. Stacy couldn't believe her ears. Matthew's story was exactly like her own. By the way, the guy listening to her story was also surprised and looked at her like she was his own. Even hugged her a few times. And the gesture was so warm, so natural, that Stacy didn't even feel embarrassed. And then my grandmother died, and I ended up on the street because a lot of relatives got smart and took the apartment for themselves. Neither my mother nor I got anything. It happens. Matthew sighed. Not only did I lose someone I was very attached to, but I had to deal with a lot of domestic problems. I had to make amends. Matthew withstood the next challenge with fortitude and dignity. He got a full-time job because the money from his part-time job would not be enough for rent and groceries. He only had a year of college left. It was a difficult period, hard work on a construction site plus studying at night. I had to scramble to keep up with lectures and keep my job. I was running back and forth like a stung man. I lost weight, I got gaunt. Almost didn't sleep for months before I got my diploma. But I got through it, Matthew said proudly. But now it's just work, he smiled. It's much easier than combining work and study. I can remember that time. Matthew worked, rented an apartment, just living. Everything seemed to be going well for him, given his background. Time flew by as we talked, and now they were at Stacy's house. The girl was getting annoyed. Wow, how fast they'd gotten there. I don't think this is a coincidence, Matthew said seriously. I've only known you for a short time, but I already feel that you're not a stranger to me. Stacy smiled. She felt exactly the same way. Matthew was so understanding, so strong and kind and good. She didn't want to part with him at all. I'll pick you up tomorrow, okay? We'll go for a walk somewhere. I'll show you my favorite places in the city. I'm sure you don't know any of them, Matthew said. So you don't mind? Of course, Stacy didn't mind. The young people exchanged phone numbers and hugged goodbye. Matthew didn't dare to kiss the girl. It happened a little later, during the very first date they had agreed on. An evening of getting to know each other. Stacy couldn't get enough of Matthew. She finally had a boyfriend. And what a guy. His innate talent for making people laugh made him an instant favorite in any company. Matthew knew and could do so many things. And of course he had a lot of friends. They would call him every now and then and ask him to go out. Matthew would tell them that he couldn't because he was out with his girlfriend. Stacy immediately felt very important and significant for the guy, and this feeling filled her heart with warmth. The young people moved in together quickly. Both felt it would be better for both of them. They didn't want to part after their outings anyway. Renting one apartment was much cheaper than renting two. Matthew moved in with Stacy because his apartment was in a remote neighborhood and Stacy's was more convenient to get to work. In the home, Matthew proved to be a homemaker. He could cook dinner, fix a faucet, and wallpaper. No detail escaped his attentive eye. The guy immediately saw the shortcomings and tried to eliminate them. True, during the joint residence some peculiarities became clear. Matthew could not live without his friends. They often called and met somewhere. After these meetings, Matthew always came back drunk, but not too drunk. It scared Stacy. She remembered what had happened to her mother because of her love of alcohol. Matthew's parents were no better. What if he turned out the same way? But the boy only laughed when Stacy shared her worries with him. Don't worry, I won't make the same mistakes as my mother. I've got my mother's example right in front of me. It won't happen to me, he said. Stacy repeatedly asked Matthew to take her with him to his friends, or invite these people to theirs. The girl wanted to meet the people who were important to her lover. But for some reason, Matthew didn't want those meetings. You see, there are only guys out there. We have our own things to do, our own jokes and conversations. And here you're a delicate, fragile girl. You can't even say a strong word in front of you. And what if someone takes a fancy to you? They'll take you away. I wouldn't want that, he explained. Stacy smiled. She was pleased with Matthew's explanation. Still, he spent too much time with his friends and came home drunk too often. The cloudy eyes, the wobbly gait, the odd wandering smile on his lips. It was a condition that frightened Stacy. And so it went for several years. Stacy and Matthew lived together. The young people became almost a family. At first, the girl dreamed that they were about to get married and, like everyone else, start planning children. The prospects were breathtaking. But these hopes were not destined to come true. Matthew was changing. Maybe he'd always been like this. Stacy just looked at the man she'd chosen through rose-colored glasses and didn't notice his flaws. In fact, at first, Matthew was trying to charm Stacy, showing his best qualities. He knew what it took to attract a girl like Annie. Matthew was disappearing more and more with his friends. Stacy waited for him at night, worried about what might happen to him on the street at this hour. Matthew had come home beaten up a few times before. He often came home drunk. Sometimes, far past midnight, the guy would fall on the couch and start singing loudly, even though he had to go to work in a couple of hours. Naturally, Matthew was unable to work after a night of drinking, and problems with work began. No employer wants an unreliable employee who can easily oversleep and not show up on time. Once or twice you could tolerate it, but when it happened again and again, Matthew was fired. The periods when the guy was out of work and out of money became longer and longer. During this time, Matthew was supported by Stacy. She paid his rent, bought groceries, and even gave him pocket money. He asked for it, and Stacy couldn't refuse. She genuinely felt sorry for Matthew. He was so sincerely remorseful each time, and he promised so convincingly that it was the last time it would happen that he would get clean, explaining his attachment to the bottle as a result of his difficult childhood. How could one not feel sorry for such a person? More on that later. Matthew changed not only outwardly, but also inwardly. He became aggressive. Now he could just yell at Stacy, call her names. Most of the time it was about money. Matthew demanded a lot of money, and Stacy's salary was small. The money was barely enough for the bare necessities. Matthew would just blow through her paycheck. Stacy couldn't even afford to go to a cafe with her friends once a month. Matthew hung out in bars almost every day. He and his buddies took turns throwing banquets. When it was Matthew's turn, he'd ask Stacy for money. He hadn't worked himself in years. Why should he? He was doing well enough. Stacy, of course, had long hoped for a miracle. She believed that with her love and attention, she could pull Matthew out of the swamp that was dragging him deeper and deeper. Stacy offered to take Matthew to the movies, dragged him out for walks in the evenings, tried to find him a job herself. It was all to no avail. A couple of times Stacy wanted to leave Matthew, even packing her things. But when Matthew saw this, he tearfully begged her to stay. "I'll manage, won't I? I love you so much. I'll be lost without you. You'll see, I won't be able to live." Stacy sighed and stayed. She really thought Matthew would be lost without her. She was very angry with her husband's friends. They were the ones Stacy blamed for what was happening to Matthew. Matthew is such a good guy. He's exactly the kind of guy I fell in love with. But unfortunately, Matthew has fallen in with the wrong crowd. His friends are dragging him down. As time went on, Stacy didn't see any change for the better. The girl suffered a lot. It is necessary to meet her love and again to lose a loved one because of addiction to drinking. Well, it was not her destiny. Living with Matthew was getting harder and harder. He didn't work at all. He didn't even work part-time like he used to. He was taking money from Stacy. She had to go grocery shopping on her way home on payday. She also transferred the rent to the landlord at once because her card was in Matthew's hands and he was looking forward to that day. And then that was it, no more money. Stacy tried to argue. Of course she wouldn't give Matthew the card, explaining to him that it was wrong. But then he'd lose his temper, start screaming, smashing everything around him, calling Stacy all kinds of names. His eyes would glow with rage. Stacy was afraid of Matthew at those moments, even though he'd never laid a finger on her. "Why do you need him like that?" wondered her friends, who were aware of what was going on. "Throw him out of the house and let him live as he likes. If only it were that simple. For one thing, Stacy still felt sorry for Matthew and loved him. Stacy cared about Matthew. Moreover, she even felt responsible for him. Secondly, the girl was elementary afraid. She realized that Matthew wasn't going anywhere, and if Stacy ran away from him, Matthew would chase her. He was becoming more and more aggressive. It was simply dangerous to make a man like that angry. Stacy could see that Matthew's behavior and her own life were only getting worse. But she saw no way out of the situation, and so she accepted everything as it was. She even tried to justify Matthew's behavior. He didn't hit her. He truly loved her. He had swore at her when she was about to leave him. And then that terrible November evening came. Stacy came home early. It was a shortened day at the remedial school. The head of the department was celebrating her anniversary. Stacy returned in high spirits. She had received a bonus as one of the best workers. Pennies, of course, like her salary, but still nice. Stacy's paycheck was small, but she liked the work itself. She knew how to deal with special children. Stacy was happy to see her little students succeed. Each one she looked for an approach, and it was even interesting. But unfortunately, working in a government agency didn't pay very generously. Stacy was offered to move to a private developmental center with good money, but she could not leave the students who were so drawn to her. There were some of them who had no contact with anyone else at all. So for now, Stacy hesitated. So the girl came home early. Matthew was sitting in the kitchen, far from sober. Stacy was very tired. It had been a long week, and there were mountains of dirty dishes, ashes scattered on the table, crumbs on the floor, and things strewn about the room in disarray. Matthew's things. Stacy felt herself starting to boil. "Matthew, what kind of pigsty have you created here?" "What pigsty?" The boy looked around the kitchen with a hazy look. "Clean it up. Now." "You want it? You clean it up," Matthew retorted, reaching for another cigarette. "She's going to boss me around. I've been at work all day. I'm tired. And you're sitting at home? I don't even ask you to cook, though I could." "At least you can clean up after yourself," Stacy said. She realized she'd been wrong to contact Matthew too late. Stacy hadn't expected him to react that way. Yes, he could snap at her, call her hurtful words in response to a remark. But this time it was different. The guy suddenly grabbed his knife and moved toward Stacy. His eyes burned with a vicious fire. "You bitch, I'm so sick of you. You're always buzzing around my ear like an annoying fly." "Matthew, what are you doing?" "Put the knife down." Stacy reached for the door in fear. Matthew obeyed and threw the knife. It fell to the tiled kitchen floor with a cold sound. The guy walked over and punched the girl in the face so hard she couldn't keep her footing. Stacy hadn't realized Matthew was so strong. Her cheek immediately flared as if it had been burned by fire. Tears sprang from her eyes. Fear gripped Stacy's heart with an icy grip. She knew Matthew was capable of anything right now. She could see it in his eyes. "I've wanted to do this for a long time," Matthew smirked. "Now I'm going to do it my way. Do you understand? You're not going to open your mouth at me anymore." Stacy nodded. She knew better than to argue with Matthew. He was capable of anything. As if to prove his point, the boy walked up to her and shoved her so hard that she hit her head on the wall. Then Matthew also kicked the girl in the back. It must have been a weak kick, but the sharp pain immediately spread through her body. "You know who's boss, don't you? You'll get more of that next time," Matthew said, and disappeared contentedly into the bedroom. Naturally, Stacy didn't wait for the next time. She knew it was dangerous to stay in the apartment with Matthew. He might even send her to the afterlife. His eyes were cloudy, half crazy. This was not the man Stacy had once loved. The girl stood up, waited until she was no longer dizzy, and slipped out the door. She didn't even take her things. She only grabbed the bag she hadn't had time to take off her shoulder. It contained her cell phone, her papers, the essentials. The rest was just a matter of time. The important thing was to get away from Matthew. He's a scary man, a monster, and Matthew is capable of hurting her, of maiming her. Even more than that, the girl has never been so afraid for her life. Stacy hurried down the stairs, fearing to hear the footsteps of an enraged Matthew behind her. He wouldn't think she was capable of escaping. But where would she go? She has no relatives in the middle of the night, no money either. Of course, Matthew will be furious when he finds her missing. Stacy wanted to be as far away from home as possible at that moment. The girl popped out into the cold November evening wearing a light coat, uncomfortable heeled shoes. It was cold, dark, uncomfortable. Stacy flew forward, unable to see the road. To keep warm, she jumped on the first bus she could find. It gave her time to catch her breath. Warm interior, soft seat, quiet, cheerful music, minimal passengers. Stacy stared out the window at the cityscape and wondered where to go. Nothing came to mind. Yes, Stacy had her friends Kira from work and her former classmate Mealy, but both were married with husbands and children. She didn't want to embarrass them. She started calling local hotels. As luck would have it, all the rooms were booked. What to do? Sure, said the stern female conductor, interrupting Stacy's frantic attempts to find a place to stay. The girl inhaled and stepped out of the cozy cabin into the unsightly night. A cold rain started the evening. Stacy's coat was immediately soaked through. The girl was completely frozen. Then she saw a supermarket in the distance, a place where she could wait out the downpour and think calmly about her situation. There had to be a way out, and Stacy would find it. She would. Just have to hide from the rain first. But I've been sitting here ever since. Stacy looked at Andrew as if waiting for his verdict. I think we should report him to the police, the man said. I can tell you've never been in this situation before. Stacy smiled. But when the police arrive, they'll find Matthew calm and sane. My words mean nothing. There's no sign of a beating. The police will leave and I'll be alone with Matthew. What do you think he'll do to me after that? Andrew shook his head. Yes, Stacy, of course you're completely right. Matthew will get away with it. Stacy, don't you have anywhere to go at all? No, the girl sighed sadly. Don't think anything bad. I'd like to offer you a place to stay tonight. I have a big house. I live there with my daughter. You will rest, and then decide how to proceed. What do they say? The morning is the morning. I hate to embarrass you, but I really don't have anywhere else to go. That's true, so I'll take it. Andrew realized that it was a strange, risky decision to let a complete stranger into the house, except that he couldn't leave the girl in trouble. She really needs help. It wouldn't be a big deal if Stacy slept over. Evie's nanny looked at Stacy with surprise as Andrew let her step forward into the house. But she didn't say anything. She was a professional and knew better than to meddle in the personal affairs of her employers. Evie's asleep in her room, the nanny reported. I wanted to wait for you, but you were late today. Thank you very much, and I apologize for the delay. Of course you will be compensated for those hours. I'm sure they will. Nanny smiled. You're always very generous. Andrew showed Stacy to the guest room. The girl looked around in surprise. It was probably the first time she had ever been in such an environment. High ceilings, wide staircase, stylish interior. And you only live here with your daughter? She asked. Yes, the two of us, sighed Andrew. Excuse me, but where's the girl's mom? She is no longer there, he replied sadly. Andrew has long been accustomed to this question. Many people were surprised that the father was raising his daughter alone. Make yourself comfortable. Take a hot shower, you need to warm up. The fridge is down there. Take whatever you want. There are clean robes in the guest bedroom. All in all, make yourself at home. Thank you so much, and I'm sorry to bother you, Stacy said. It's no bother at all. Andrew smiled. The main thing is that everything ends well for you. Andrew went to his room. On the way, he looked into Evie's bedroom. The girl was sleeping sweetly under the blanket, putting her hand under her cheek. Her hair was strewn across the pillow. A light blush played on her cheeks. The nightlight on the nightstand glowed faintly, as always. Evie was afraid to stay in the dark. Andrew took a quick shower, changed into his pajamas, and laid his head down on the pillow with pleasure. How tired he was today. It was a little strange to realize that there was a stranger, a complete stranger, in the house right now. But Stacy was just a confused girl in a difficult situation. She wasn't lying. Andrew could feel it. By his age, he had learned to be a pretty good judge of character. Andrew woke up from an unusual sound, glanced at the clock. It was almost 4. What's wrong? There were still hours to go before the alarm clock rang. What woke him up? The singing. It was a quiet, gentle singing, something subtly familiar, even native. Andrew raised himself on his elbow and listened. The singing seemed to be coming from Evie's bedroom. What the hell was that? And then it hit him. He remembered that Stacy, the girl with the hard luck he'd picked up from the supermarket, was sleeping at the house tonight. The man jumped up and rushed into Evie's bedroom. Why was this girl sneaking into his daughter's room? What was on her mind? Andrew wanted to rush into the nursery to give the guest an interrogation, but he was stopped by a ringing child's voice. Again. Let's do it again. My mom used to sing this song to me. Andrew cautiously peeked into the bedroom. He saw a touching picture. His daughter was lying in her crib, looking at the visitor with a smile. Stacy was sitting nearby in a high chair, stroking the girl's head and softly singing her a lullaby. Andrew remembered the song. It had once been sung by his wife to their daughter. But how had the little girl memorized it at such a young age? He froze, not believing his ears. The girl was actually talking to Stacy. She asked to sing the lullaby again and said that her mother sang it to her. Andrew's heart was pounding frantically. He was afraid to believe that his daughter had finally spoken after a long silence. Maybe he just imagined after a dream? That's it, baby girl. It's time for bed. Stacy smiled as she tucked the girl in. Good night, said the girl clearly. Andrew barely held back a sigh of surprise. Just don't you go away. We'll see each other tomorrow, won't we? She asked. Yes, I'll see you. Stacy nodded. As she left the room, she ran into Andrew. Oh, we woke you up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, she fussed. It's just that the girl screamed in her sleep, and I ran to soothe her with a song, out of habit. She always helps my students. But how did you know her name was Evia? I did not tell you, surprised Andrew. How did you know? Stacy was surprised. The girl told me. We met her. Let's go into the living room. I'll try to make the suggested revisions, keeping it close to the original text. I have a serious conversation to have with you. Okay, Stacy flapped her eyes in confusion. She couldn't understand what was going on. Oh. In the living room, Andrew slowly and thoroughly told her Evie's story. He had to mention Kira's death and the girl's many diagnoses. You see, since Kira's death, Evie hadn't spoken a word, and then suddenly she spoke. I didn't realize she was speechless, Stacy said, surprised. She got in touch with me as soon as she heard the lullaby. She said her mom used to sing that song to her. Wow, poor child still remembers, although it would seem was quite tiny then, sighed Andrew. I have a proposal to you, since you have such a beneficial effect on Evie. You are also a teacher. You have experience in dealing with special children. Could you be a kind of nanny or teacher for my girl? You don't have a place to live now, and here you'll have your own room. I won't hurt your salary. Wow, this is so unexpected, Stacy exclaimed. I'd love to be Evie's nanny, but I have a job. I can't leave my students, you know. I understand, Andrew nodded. You don't have to sit with her all day. The main thing is to come here after work, communicate with Evie, on weekends, maybe spend some lessons with her, or just walk. Naturally, if you need time to yourself, it's not even negotiable. But at any given moment, Andrew was willing to do anything just to keep Stacy by Evie's side. That girl had worked a real miracle. But what if she suddenly disappeared and his girl went silent again? What if leaving Stacy would be a new trauma for her? Stacy stayed at Andrew's house. She turned out to be a very smiling and friendly girl. Evie loved her new nanny, or as she called her friend. Stacy always knew how to keep her entertained. They drew together, made plasticine, even embroidered. Evie was talking now. Andrew couldn't believe it. I make edits to the text, keeping it close to the original. Strangely enough, the speech of little Evie turned out to be very literate, developed. It turns out that all this time she was learning unnoticed from others, absorbed everything like a sponge, and now quietly built beautiful and long phrases. And it also turned out that Evie is an incredibly capable girl. She had a talent for the exact sciences, Stacy had said repeatedly. She'd make a great physicist or mathematician, she repeated. Stacy was a little wrong, however. Evie turned out to be a promising computer programmer. When in the 5th grade she started computer science, the girl immediately demonstrated outstanding talents. The teacher, of course, could not help but notice it. She immediately began to send her capable student to Olympiads of various levels, and almost always Evie returned with awards. Andrew couldn't get enough of his daughter. He was very grateful to Stacy because it was thanks to her talent, or rather her gift of communicating with special children, that Evie began to speak again. Stacy was in denial. She's not my client. She didn't have any serious diagnoses or disabilities, just stress. That's how she reacted to losing her mother. I had nothing to do with it. She would have talked sooner or later on her own. Andrew didn't agree. He knew for sure that if it weren't for Stacy, his girl would have had to go to a special school for kids with serious mental health issues. And then what would Evie be like now? By the time Evie started winning her first awards as a young programmer, Andrew and Stacy were already married. Yeah, that's what happened. They were living side by side. At first, all their conversations revolved solely around Evie, and then somehow, gradually, it became clear to both of them that there was something going on between them. They were drawn to each other. It was pointless to deny it. By the way, Evie had been involved. The clever girl saw everything, understood everything, and was very happy about it. It was she who pushed her father to make the first step. One day, Evie told Andrew straight out that it was time to ask Stacy out. "You both need a date," the 10-year-old said with a sly smile. "Go ahead, ask her to the movies." "And you do not mind?" "Why would it? I wonder." Surprised Andrew. I, on the contrary, in favor, nodded Evie. "Only next time we'll go out together somewhere. Deal?" So with Evie's encouragement, Stacy and Andrew began to meet, and then more and more. Soon it became obvious to both of them that they were literally made for each other. And so the wedding took place. Quiet, modest, but very beautiful and somehow cozy. Now Evie had a little sister, Mealy. She's 2 years old now. She is very perky and quick, just like her older sister at her age. By the way, it was Evie who chose the name for the baby. She adored her little sister, babysat her, taught her everything. Dressed up the little girl as a doll and even boasted about it in front of her many friends. Andrew was happy. He has a favorite loving wife and 2 wonderful daughters. Healthy, beautiful, intelligent. They have a close-knit family where everyone loves and supports each other. Stacy and Evie, they are like girlfriends in general. It's so nice to watch them when they do something together, cooking, discussing plans for tomorrow, choosing outfits for an event. Sometimes Andrew wondered what would have happened to him and Evie if he hadn't met Stacy at the supermarket, or would have walked past as he'd intended to do at first. Perhaps it was fate itself after all.